It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with an update from the Middle East, where at least 2 people have been killed, 76 wounded in that Israeli strike on the Beirut area. That word from Lebanon's health ministry. Israel said its military struck Hezbollah's main headquarters in southern Beirut, ramping up tensions in the Middle East. Stocks continue to trade mixed in the U.S. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average up now by 178 points, a gain of 0.4%. S&P 500 index lower now by 7 points, down by about 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 75, a decline of 0.4%. 10-year yield 3.74%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.56%. Spot gold down $28 the ounce, down now by 1.1%. And crude oil advancing, right now unchanged on the day after an earlier pop on Mideast tensions. West Texas Intermediate 67.66 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington, and once again your host, here she is, Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lines in Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we are about to have a very important conversation as we are just weeks away from the 2024 presidential election. The Department of Justice this afternoon just announced new charges against multiple people for allegedly carrying out an Iranian-backed operation to hack the campaign of Donald Trump. That hack, remember, was first confirmed by the campaign last month. Security officials said Iran had sent the stolen material to people linked to what was then the Biden re-election campaign, journalists as well. And we want to have more on this and the wider efforts of foreign actors to interfere in the U.S. election, and turn for an exclusive interview to the U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, who is joining us now. Ma'am, thank you so much for being with us here on Bloomberg. This is an incredibly important conversation. If we could begin with just the charges that were unveiled today and these specific actors who have now been indicted, what do you know about the intentions of them? Is this part of a wider effort Iran is using to turn the tide against Donald Trump in this election?
Well, good afternoon, Kaylee, and thanks very much for having me. What we've announced today are charges against 3 Iranian hackers who are engaging in a malign foreign influence campaign. The charges we have laid out today and announced today lay out a years-long hacking campaign targeting current and former government officials, targeting journalists, and most recently, targeting U.S. political campaigns. As you indicated, these charges include discussion and laying out of a malicious cyber activity that the intelligence community and the FBI has previously referenced. These efforts included malicious Iranian cyber actors sending unsolicited emails to individuals then associated with the campaign of President Biden, and those emails contained stolen excerpts of stolen non-public material from the Trump campaign. I should point out, Kaylee, that there's no indication that the recipients replied to those emails. To your question about intent, the hackers made clear in their very own words, and we've laid this out in the charging document we unsealed today, and that intent is to undermine the campaign of former President Trump in advance of the election.
And I wonder, ma'am, how you see these efforts differing or working in tandem with the efforts of other adversaries, be it Russia or China, for example. Are they working in concert, or are they all working in different ways with similar motives?
Well, look, this is part of the charges we announced today and the broader aggressive activity that we are seeing from Iran, from Russia, from China, are part of a very complex, diverse, and aggressive foreign malign influence effort that we are seeing from our adversaries in this election cycle. So the charges we've announced today, I think, are consistent with what we have been seeing and warning about. The intelligence community has been quite clear over the last weeks and months about what we are seeing in the way of foreign malign influence. You have seen the Justice Department take aggressive action in the last several weeks. We unveiled the operations of Russian actors In the last couple of weeks, we exposed Russian foreign malign influence campaigns, again, all directed at and in an effort to sow discord, to sow mistrust, and to undermine our confidence in our election process.
Well, of course, what you're alluding to, the seizure of dozens of domains that the DOJ is alleging have been propagating Russian-backed efforts to spread foreign malign influence, including around the presidential election. I believe there were some 32 of those domains. Ma'am, how far does that web go, and what else is Russia specifically doing? Are you seeing it having an impact?
That's exactly right, Kaylee. What we exposed a few weeks ago were Putin-directed efforts using a Russian state-operated media arm, RT, to spread Russian propaganda, to spread pro-Russian narratives, using unwitting American commentators to do so, to funnel millions of dollars to a U.S. company in order to do that. And we also exposed the work of a proxy company, again, Putin-directed, called the Social Design Agency, which is a proxy company used by Russia to push out AI-generated content, again, pushing out Russian propaganda targeting U.S. voters and specific voter demographics, all in an effort to influence the election, to undermine confidence in our election process, to undermine also, from the Russians' perspective, to undermine our support for Ukraine. So this is part of a broader scheme and efforts, very aggressive efforts, by Russian foreign malign actors.
Again, we're in conversation here with the U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Obviously, ma'am, there are a number of channels and ways in which mis and disinformation that could be aimed at influencing voters can circulate in the modern age, including on social media, on platforms, for example, like X. Is the DOJ working with X and Elon Musk to try to tamp down on that mis and disinformation? And if you're trying, are you seeing cooperation on the other side?
Well, look, what we're doing is doing everything we can to investigate, to expose, and to disrupt these activities. When we see foreign malign influence activity on platforms across the United States, we are taking that information, using that information, and sharing it with platforms, including X. We are very focused on providing social media platforms information, actionable information in real time so that they can take action under their own discretion, making their own judgments consistent with the First Amendment. We are providing them information, and then they are taking action at their own discretion to address that activity that we point out to them. So we will continue to do that. Our focus is on making sure we are exposing this activity so that Americans can be discerning consumers, because, Kaylee, American voters should be deciding our election, not our foreign adversaries.
Well, on that point, ma'am, it's one thing to put out information, be it dis or misinformation, aimed at influencing American votes. It's another thing entirely to actually try to disrupt or tamper with the electoral process itself. To what extent is the Department of Justice concerned about potential cyber or even physical disruptions to the election process, be it on Election Day in November or in the early voting leading up to it?
So two things I would say on this, Kaylee. One, we see our foreign adversaries trying to put into their malign influence campaigns disinformation and misinformation about the vulnerability of our voting systems. Our voting systems are quite resilient, and they are quite diffuse, and they are, by and large, not connected, and almost a majority not connected to the internet. My colleagues at CISA over at DHS have the lead in for the federal government in working to protect our critical infrastructure, and importantly, working with state and local officials to protect that infrastructure, that voting infrastructure. Remember, the voting in this country is controlled owned, operated, and administered all at the state and local level. So our job in the federal government, working across the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, is to assist our state and local partners in that effort. We are sharing information about efforts to influence those that electoral process, but the election systems and the infrastructure themselves are very diffuse and very diffuse across the state and local jurisdictions and not connected to the internet. So people should be on the lookout for misinformation about that.
Madam Deputy Attorney General, I'd like to turn to another issue. As yesterday, the DOJ also charged 2 Russian nationals in a crypto laundering scheme. What can you tell us about how pervasive these potential laundering networks are, what their aims are, and how the DOJ is working in concert with other agencies like, say, the SEC in cracking down in this regard?
So you're quite right, Kaylee. We took action yesterday to disrupt a number of malicious cyber criminals and to disrupt the criminal ecosystem that fuels their activity. 2 Russian nationals, and also we disrupted an illicit crypto exchange called Cryptix. This is part of our overall effort to disrupt wherever we can the criminal ecosystem that is fueling everything from ransomware to darknet drug trafficking to money laundering. And it was money laundering that was really at issue here. These are 2 Russian nationals engaged in a massive money laundering schemes that was fueling criminal activity across a whole spectrum of areas, as I said, ransomware and drug trafficking. What we are seeing is crypto, for instance, is the lifeblood of a lot of this illicit activity, including ransomware. And it may be advertised as borderless, but what we are showing, including with yesterday's charges that we brought, is that we will follow it wherever it goes, including to the darkest corners, and hold individuals to account.
Finally, ma'am, while we have you, I won't ask you to comment directly on the indictment of Eric Adams, but I do have a wider question for you about the perception and institutional trust in the Department of Justice. After that indictment came down, we heard from Donald Trump calling the Justice Department, quote, dirty players. I don't have to tell you he's argued consistently that the DOJ is being weaponized against him. Many of his supporters believe that largely to be true. How much harder is it for you to do your work when your credibility is being questioned by people at the highest levels of American politics?
I'm not going to comment on those attacks, Kaylee, except to say that the men and women of the Justice Department are doing their job every single day without fear or favor, without regard to any political affiliation, following the facts wherever they lead. And yesterday's charges announced by the Southern District of New York, I think, reflect exactly that principle.
All right, we will leave it on that note. We sincerely appreciate your time. U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco for an exclusive interview here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. Now, we do briefly in our final minutes here want to get the latest on that Eric Adams case I was alluding to. He pleaded not guilty in federal court in New York to these charges today. Bloomberg's June Grasso, host of Bloomberg Law, is with me now. So, June, obviously we also heard from his attorney in the aftermath of his arraignment. They're going to look to dismiss these charges next week. What's the likelihood that would be successful?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that they'll be successful, but he gave us a hint of what the defense will be, and that's a time-honored defense of the main witness for the prosecution is just lying. There's an Adams staffer who is mentioned time and time again in the indictment, and he'll likely be cooperating, probably is cooperating with the federal prosecution. And Alex Spiro, the attorney for Mayor Adams, said he's lying, and the feds know it, and we want them to turn over that information. That when they first interviewed him, he said that Adams was innocent. So that appears to be the way the defense is going, at least right now.
Okay, so I guess we'll see how that defense plays out. We also heard from Alex Spiro that he's going to look for a speedy trial in this case, June, I guess assuming they don't have success in the dismissal of these charges. How should we be defining speedy here in the Southern District of New York?
That's a great question. I would say maybe 6 months, but that would be really speedy. I mean, it also depends on how fast they get all the evidence they want. It depends on how many motions. I imagine the defense here is going to make a lot of motions. not only to dismiss, but to exclude evidence. So I think that it depends a lot on the motions that are going to be made, but that would be very speedy. I think that Menendez's trial, it took about a year to get to, and that was pretty fast. So it would have to be, who knows? It's just such a hard thing to figure out. It depends on so many different factors.
Fair
we'll
enough.
see, I
All right,
guess.
June Grasso. We will indeed. And of course, on Bloomberg Law, you can find June Grasso taking us through it all as this plays out, as you always can trust here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll have much more ahead on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. on this story and others as Kamala Harris heads to the border in Arizona today. We'll have the latest. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week is straight ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good Friday afternoon, everybody. Radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We do it across the platforms here on Business Week. He's back.
I'm back.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I
It's
had a good time off, but it's good to be back in the studio, Carol.
It's great to have you back. It's been a busy week. I'm just going to tell you.
Yeah, and actually it's shaping up to be a busy week next week also, because we already got that September jobs report coming next week. The month isn't even over yet, and we're talking about it, Carol.
We just jumped from data point to data point. All right, everybody. So let's get to the setup on this Friday, September 27th. Stocks seem to kind of struggle to find a clear direction. We, though, are definitely front and center and focused when it comes to the Fed's favored inflation gauge.
Also, how it's not all smooth sailing when it comes to those selling of those popular GLP-1 obesity drugs. Madison Muller's swinging by. We're going to check in with her about everything that's happening in that space.
Got to talk a little politics, too. We've got a razor-thin lead across those very important swing states in that tight U.S. presidential race. So we're going to break it down, the latest poll from the U.S. In the meantime, have you been following the trade?
I've been following the trade. I think it was at
Really?
42 S&P 500 records so far this year. Is that right?
Yes. Well done. Well
Okay.
done.
Yeah, I'm following a little bit. I can never really unplug, Carol. You know how it is.
All right. So let's find out what's going on this Friday trade. Let's toss things over to Charlie Pellet.
All right, I thank you very much indeed. Might see number 43 later on today. Stocks on track for their third consecutive week of gains. Despite languishing today, little change on the S&P as investors were repeatedly reassured that the economy is cooling without falling off a cliff. Our Stuart Paul and Michael McKee will have a whole lot more on the economy coming up in just a moment. S&P right now back in the green, has been fluctuating up 1.5746. The Dow up another 216, up by 0.5%. NASDAQ, though, in the red, down 28, drop there of 0.1%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares advancing by 0.9%. 10-year 3.75%, with the 2-year right now at 3.56%. Spot gold tumbling $27 the ounce, down 1%, 26.45. And West Texas Intermediate crude, we're seeing some big moves there today. Right now, just about flat on the day at 67.70 for a barrel of WTI. Volkswagen is cutting its annual guidance for a second time this year on weak demand for its passenger cars, marking the latest blow to Germany's struggling automotive sector. All three major German car makers, including Mercedes and BMW, have now warned on profit. ADRs of Volkswagen today down 0.7%. So again, recapping stocks mix, the Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. NASDAQ is lower. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Yeah, and if you check out those updates, you're going to find out what the latest read on inflation is. In fact, Tim, it's really the Fed's blah, blah, blah.
It's Friday, Carol. You got this.
Should we try that again?
Yeah, maybe you should take a
Preferred
2-week
measure
vacation.
of inflation. All right, it's time for me to take off. Pass the baton. My time to take off.
Household spending rose modestly in August. It underscored that cooling economy. U.S. consumer sentiment continued to rise, though. In late September, it reached a 5-month high on more optimism about the economy. This is in the wake, Carol, of the Fed's interest rate cut. The interest rate cut heard around the world, 50 basis points last week.
Yeah, that was a big one. With our Eco and Fed Roundup, let's get to it. Bloomberg News international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee. He's been off for a few days, but lucky for us, back in studio and back in the office. Also with us and back with us, Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist Stuart Paul. Great to have you both with us. We talked with you, Stuart, throughout the week about some of the economic news that came out. But Mike, I want to start with you. This is an important inflation report, also an update on household spending. A little bit up a little bit in the month of August?
Inflation was very well contained in August, up just 1/10 for each month, and the headline drops significantly. Core base effects rose 1/10 on a year-over-year basis, but the trend is very favorable. It's about 1.5% for the headline over the last 3 months on an annualized basis. So we're running below where the Fed's target is. This just tells the Fed that inflation is well behaved and they can do what they want to do November, as long as the September PCE report comes in okay on October 31st. And you mentioned we get a jobs report on Friday. We get another jobs report before November 1st, and their next meeting is November 7th. So while this is good news for the Fed and it keeps them on the right path, it doesn't make any decisions for them.
So, Stuart, come on in here, because you argue that the most recent data actually validates the 50 basis point cut that we got from the Fed last week. To Mike's point, though, what does it mean as the Fed moves ahead? for that getting that data on November 1st, and then, of course, the data that we get next week. What are you looking at Bloomberg Economics?
Looking at most of the details of the report, again, as Mike said, the Fed is on track to basically do whatever it wants. I think that the data actually opens the door for an accelerated pace of rate cuts. We're maintaining a pace that's larger than 25 basis points, which is what most folks are expecting. Personal income surprised to the downside because of weak investment income, because of weak interest income, dividend income, and small owners, business income. Spending surprised to the downside because people are reining in their spending on goods. If you're looking at the inflation numbers, where are we seeing prices softening most? It's in some of the more discretionary services like recreational goods and services. So all of the sort of underlying factors of the report today are very favorable for a Fed that's looking to get back to neutral. Now, as Mike said, we have a jobs report coming up. We still have a lot more data that we're going to see before the November meeting. But this is a favorable report for the Fed if the Fed wants to cut.
My bar tab wasn't any lower last night. I'll tell you that.
You gotta go. You gotta be shopping at Costco, Mike. That's the problem.
Or going to a bar
Drink,
at Costco?
drinking at Costco.
Yeah, drinking at Costco. Hey, they have liquor stores at some
Those
Costco's in some
$1.25
states.
hot dogs.
Are
yeah.
we likely to see any of that? And you know what I mean in terms of prices
Prices
actually?
go down. Prices generally don't go down. I mean, you see prices rise and fall on commodity goods like meat and obviously gasoline. But basically, once a company hits a price level, it's not going to roll things back unless they're feeling competitive pressure to do so. We saw that play out over years with the so-called Walmart effect. But I don't think people are going to see any kind of major pullback in the overall cost of what they buy.
Well, I brought up Costco for this specific reason because we did hear yesterday from the CFO who said that home furnishings and tires sold particularly well. Inflation is cooling. Shoppers are purchasing more non-food items.
I bought some tires about a month or a month and a half ago.
At
not
Costco?
from Walmart, no, or not from Costco rather, but I did buy some tires.
But he even said that consumer electronics and appliances are actually getting cheaper. I know we can't look at Costco as a metric for the entire economy, but what do you make of that?
The hard part with consumer electronics is part of the change in price is what they call hedonic. We have improvements in the goods, and they sell for the same or a slightly higher price, but then if you're looking at what you get for it, you're getting more money for it. That's always been an issue in the CPI, for example, and they try to adjust for it, but people don't understand that. You're not going to go in and get a whole lot cheaper computer. You're not going to the Apple store and getting
your iPhone's not any cheaper than it was last year.
And that was a very good point that people made, is the iPhone is not getting any cheaper.
You know, I talked with the IMF managing director this week at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum, and, you know, we're still watching inflation, like globally around the world, and I do wonder, Stuart, that our expectations around what the Fed might do for the rest of this year, like we need to be smart about that. We could be, optimistic that maybe we won't get all these rate moves, right? Or you guys don't feel that way?
So it seems like a lot of the major central banks around the world have been looking toward the Fed for a signal as to how quickly they can move. The Fed has been on hold, and it found itself a little bit behind the curve. You see a couple of central banks like the Swiss National Bank and the Bank of Canada, where they've actually been willing to move, but the Bank of England, ECB, have been hitting the brakes a little bit because they wanted to see what would come from the Fed. Now that the Fed is cutting, and now that we have some disinflation here in the U.S., I think that there is room for other central banks to continue following our lead as we head into the end of the year.
Well, that's what I always wonder, Mike, like cumulative. You look like, Stuart, you look around the globe. I mean, when we get multiple central banks, especially major central banks, there is there a cumulative effect in terms of the amount of money that's flown around or the cost of money around the world and the impact that has?
Well, it depends. It's very hard to measure because you have to define what liquidity actually means in this case. I had a long chat about this with the Bloomberg Intelligence Treasury guys today.
Yeah.
And one of the issues is when the Fed lets a security mature, it basically destroys the money that was created when they originally bought the security. And so the money supply doesn't change with QT in that sense. But there's still rolling over some securities, so you still have money going in and out. It's not a huge impact that's happening from these rate cuts, but cumulatively there'll be an impact, but it won't be won't be easy to measure, and it won't be something that's going to change the world.
Hey, Stuart, help us think about what happens next week. Look ahead to next week on this Friday afternoon. We hear from Jay Powell on Tuesday. As Mike mentioned, we get the monthly jobs report for September next Friday. What's the next catalyst? What's the next focal point you're watching at Bloomberg Economics?
We get a lot of data next week. It's not just Labor Week. We also get PMIs. Based on regional surveys from the Fed, manufacturing conditions actually look weaker. I'm a bit surprised to see the consensus is expecting a modest increase in PMIs. We're thinking that things are going to actually tick down a little bit based on less favorable supply conditions. At the same time, on Tuesday, we're going to get job openings data. This is for the month of August, so it's a bit delayed. JOLTS are always a bit delayed. We're expecting to see job openings increase by about 110,000 jobs during the month, but still the ratio of job openings to unemployed workers, so the ratio of labor demand to labor supply, is going to be weaker than it was pre-COVID. And the big kahuna for the week is, of course, going to be the jobs report on Friday. And this is going to be an absolutely miserable jobs report to trade around. The consensus is expecting 130,000 jobs added during the month, but there's two-way risk here. So one of our top-down modeling techniques using high-frequency data is expecting and estimating that we're going to have nearly double that, about 250,000 jobs added.
Oh, my God.
Our Bloomberg Economics nowcast sees about the same thing, 225,000 jobs added during the month. But if you look historically, September is one of the months where we get the biggest misses.
Yeah.
For
Somebody's going to be right there, Stuart.
So on average of the past 25 years,
Yeah.
the consensus has overestimated payrolls by about 35,000 jobs. That ends up going away in revisions. So this is going to be one of those months where there is going to be a large surprise and then a large revision. So
Yeah.
Hold on to your hats.
Which is why the Fed is happy that it doesn't have to make a decision based on
That's
this
right.
report. And they have the one coming out November 1st, the October payrolls report.
So they have a little bit more time there. All right, guys, thank you so much. So appreciate it. Good to have you back, Mike. Bloomberg News International Economics and Policy Correspondent Michael McKee. And, of course, our thanks always to Bloomberg Economics U.S. economist Stuart Paul joining us both in our studio. Now we got to get to two stocks that are on our radar.
Yeah, that includes Novo Nordisk and WW. The obesity drug hype that fueled huge gains in Novo looks to be running out of steam. We have ADRs of Novo down about 5% over the past two trading days. This after a JP Morgan analyst said the firm's third quarter results may show slower than expected sales of its blockbuster weight loss drug. We're talking about, Carol, Wegovy.
Yeah, and we've got another company that was leaning big time into these drugs. We're talking about WW Internationally, formerly Weight Watchers, ousting its CEO, Seema Sistani, after a tumultuous, 2.5-year tenure at the diet company. So let's get to our resident expert on GLP-1 drugs in the industry that's become such a giant, it feels like, just in a year and a half or so. And she's kind of taken one for the team here today because we know she's not feeling well. So we are so appreciative because she's the one we wanted to talk to. Madison Muller, she's Bloomberg News health reporter joining us from Lake George. Sorry you're not feeling well. Hope you feel better soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be quick.
Of course, only for you guys. I'm happy to join you guys anytime.
We so appreciate it. So JP Morgan, their call on Novo. What are you hearing about Novo and Wegovy?
Yeah, it's interesting because we know that Lilly and Novo have both had supply issues, and there's been some concerns going into earnings the last couple of quarters about missing sales estimates, and Lilly's sort of smashed through those. Novo, on the other hand, is still struggling to get a handle on its supply of Wegovy. And when we think about the many things that Lilly's doing now, not only to appeal directly to consumers, but also to improve supply, they're offering vial formulations of their drug Zepbound. They also have Lilly Direct, where patients can go directly online through Lilly to get these drugs. Novo's not doing those things, and they're still really struggling to build out production capacity quickly enough to make more of their drugs. So, we kind of see we're starting to see Lilly pull ahead when it comes to sales of Wegovy and Zepbound, while Novo is still struggling to really get a handle on this. And that's clear that analysts are thinking about this going into earnings, that this might have an effect on sales this quarter.
Madison, how much of this is about what's in the pipeline, too, over at Novo, and to what extent analysts and investors actually think that has a chance in this space?
Yeah, that's a good point, too. Both Lilly and Novo are working on next-generation versions of their drugs. They're working on oral formulations of their drugs. Novo actually already has a pill that they should be able to make but can't, because that pill requires more of the active ingredient that's used in Wegovy, and that's the problem, is Novo just can't make enough of it. So they're really hindered by these supply issues, and that's, affecting even these next generation treatments. Like we've talked about, people definitely want pill versions of these drugs. Not everyone wants to take a shot every single week, and pills would be much more accessible. Novo does have a next generation drug that it's working on called CagriSema, that could compete with Zepbound, sort of on par with the same amount of weight loss, but that's still, a little bit further away. Lilly has lots of different things that they're working on, next generation treatments. So it could come down to excitement about the future of the company's pipelines as well.
Hey, Kiddo, why is Novo's supply chain more problematic than Lilly's?
So the companies are having different problems. Lilly's problem is that they say that they don't have supply problems per se. It's more that the complexity of the auto injector pens that are used to inject the medicines are really complicated to make. That sort of bottleneck supply. Novo, on the other hand, is struggling to make enough of the actual medicine, the active ingredient that goes into those pens. So the problems are pretty different and have different solutions.
Hey, let's go head on over to WW. Carol mentioned Sima Sistani out after 2.5 years as CEO over there. We're seeing the stock down 3.4% as a result. Sometimes when we see executive change at the top, we see shares rise. Is this because they don't know who the next CEO is going to be? Give us an idea of what's going on over at WW.
And can we just remind everybody, it's now...
Weight Watchers.
Weight Watchers is now an 82-cent a share stock.
That's
so
a good
go
point.
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's crazy. The stock has lost about 90% of its value over the last year. I think when the company announced that they were going to get into GLP-1s last year, there was some hope that, okay, they're, getting on board with the changes that are happening in the diet and the weight loss industry. But what we've seen over the last year is that they've really struggled to bring that vision to fruition, and that hasn't really paid off for them. They were hoping that, by having a sort of digital app and offering these medications, that would help replace the revenue that was lost from closing a lot of these in-person Weight Watchers programs that they were known for, and their subscriber base really shrinking. But we haven't really seen that happen. I mean, their revenues continued to fall since 2019. Sistani was brought on to help turn things around, and we haven't seen that happen. And so, today they announced that she would be leaving.
This company had a $6.7 billion market cap, Carol, back in 2018, now $65 million.
It's staggering. Hey, 30 seconds left here, Madison. I mean, I was thinking about Roe, right? You can also get these GLP-1 drugs from them. So I do wonder, is it just that the Weight Watchers, we don't need to go there for the drugs, and it just doesn't make sense?
Yeah, you're right. That's what we are seeing. I think Oprah said this on her program back in March of we have Wegovy and Zepbound. Why do we need Weight Watchers now? And Weight Watchers was still trying to sell itself as a program and a community. And the truth is, I guess this is the proof. People don't want that. They just want to get the drugs from Roe or from Hims or whoever else is offering them.
And Oprah, of course, used to be a big supporter of Weight
she's on the board.
Right, and owned a lot of shares. But it's very different now. Madison, feel better. Get better. Have a good weekend. Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller. Be sure to check her out on Twitter and on the Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the U.S. stock market struggling for direction. Bottom line, those stocks are on track for their third consecutive week of gains, despite languishing today as investors were repeatedly reassured that the economy is cooling without falling off a cliff. Treasuries rallied as fresh data cemented bets on further interest rate cuts by the Fed. S&P right now, little change, down 3, down less than 0.1%. The Dow up 191, up 0.5. Nasdaq down 58, a decline of 0.3%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares climbing higher, up by about 0.8%. We've got the 10-year yielding 3.74%, with the 2-year right now 3.56%. Gold now down 1%, down $26 the ounce to $36.45. West Texas Intermediate crude up by 0.9% on heightened Middle East tensions, 68.26 a barrel on WTI. Costco wholesale posted higher than expected profit as moderating prices fueled consumer spending and store traffic climbed. Costco shares, though, slumping today, down by 1.9%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie. As Tim just mentioned, I do have an app, and was asking.
I didn't even know this app existed.
There's, I think, multiple apps actually.
There's an app for everything.
I was just like, how many days until the election? It's 38 days to go until the November presidential election, folks. So I know Charlie, wow, is right. It's all about right now campaign rallies, campaign speeches, debates. We've got a big VP one coming up next week. You've got some interviews, media appearances, and then Tim, I feel like it's lots of polling.
I thought you were going to say watches. Watches being sold by the former president and current Republican
Aren't there like
candidate.
boots too?
Boots, yeah.
They look like Timberland boots.
Trading cards too.
Trading cards.
Yeah. We're not here to talk about that, though. We are here to
Polling.
talk about the polling. And we are out with a new poll on the race about a month before the election. Vice President Kamala Harris eroding former President Donald Trump's advantage on the economy. We're going to dig into it right now with Bloomberg News senior White House and politics correspondent with us from our Washington, D.C. bureau, Gregory Cordy. Gregory, the latest Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll, give us some details. It has Kamala Harris with this razor-thin edge over Donald Trump in these swing states. When was the polling done, and how do you explain the shift to her?
Yeah, the polling was done, if I remember the dates right, September 19th to the 25th. This is all after the most recent debate this month. And it shows that in her worst state, which is Georgia, they're dead even. And then you go up to Nevada, where she's leading by 7 points. So that would seem to be good for her. But remember, on every single one of these states, it's still within the margin of error, which is sort of remarkable because we bumped up our sample size this month to about 6,100 respondents. And even with the larger sample size, that should bring down the margin of error. And yet these races are still within the margin of error. So that's why we call it a razor-thin lead right now. You can say that she's in the lead even with the margin of error, but it's really, it could go either way.
Any indications on either the double haters that were, when it was Biden and Trump, or the undecided? Are we getting any indications of people kind of making up their mind? And if so, what are the issues that maybe are making them like one candidate over another?
Yeah, the number of undecideds across the 7 swing states is down to 2%. Another 1% say they're not going to show up to vote. It's not even a matter of them deciding between the two. They just don't want to vote, right? So, so that's a relatively small number, and that's not unusual as we get closer to election day. People do begin to make up their minds, or maybe they had their minds made up all along. They just were reluctant to tell pollsters until we get closer. Of course, remember, early voting is starting in many states. So beginning with the next poll, when I talk to you next month, we'll be able to get you some information, not just on how people intend to vote, but how people have already voted, which is going to be an important metric to kind of gauge the impact of early voting. But yeah, the number of undecided voters, the number of double haters is down precipitously as well since Kamala Harris got in the race. It's a completely different dynamic.
Is that her biggest advantage, that she is not Biden and she's not Trump?
Yeah, I mean, so the remarkable thing is that she's managed to campaign as both an incumbent and as an outsider, as a change candidate. And that's obviously a very unusual, but also very potentially powerful combination. What we've seen in this poll in the 12 months that we've been doing this now, we started last October, and we're now in the October before the election, is that people's perception of the economy has not improved at all, at least in terms of the national economy. We're seeing some places where people say their local economy is better, which is an important measure of how they really feel about the economy. But they say the national economy is bad. Kamala Harris is the incumbent vice president of the United States. She's part of this Biden administration whose policies were unpopular, and yet people are giving her sort of a fresh slate on these economic issues. We're seeing month after month her closing the gap with Donald Trump on the questions like who do you trust most to take care of the economy? Who do you trust most on taxes, on housing costs, on all these issues? She's narrowing the gap, or even, and this is the remarkable one to me, I've mentioned taxes, she now has more trust from swing state voters on taxes than Donald Trump has. And of course, that's a key Republican issue. So she's really made up a lot of ground on that, and she's going into Trump's strengths, really campaigning on what were issues that Trump would have won on just a few months ago.
Hey, I also do wonder, money, ads, political ads, how that impacts polling, because I do know that we know Kamala Harris has raised a lot of money, a lot of ads. We're seeing it in a big way as we get closer and closer to November. And I'm curious about that impact on polling results. And then when we, as you mentioned, that early voting, as we start to get some indications on that, how does that tend to impact polling results?
Yeah, it's hard to separate the impact of ads and votes. I think certainly the numbers I just mentioned in terms of candidate trust, the issues that she's closing the trust gap on are the ones that she's running wall-to-wall campaign ads on. So I have to think that they're having an effect. She does have a funding raising advantage against former President Trump, although Trump has all of these super PACs that are coming in and spending a lot of money as well. Candidate money, her money goes further, and she gets preferential rates. She gets preferential ad slots in these states, which are being inundated with ads. There's hardly any more inventory left to buy. And so, yeah, I have to think that it's having an impact. And in terms of the early vote, look, about more than 60% of voters in 2020 voted by non-traditional means. Early voting, absentee voting. Of course, we were in a pandemic, but people seem to kind of like that mode of voting. It's more convenient. They don't have to think about where they're going to be on election day. They don't have to worry about the weather. They can get it over with. And the campaigns would very much like you to bank your vote, to get that vote in there, because what the campaigns do is they try to keep track of who's returned their votes. And if you live in a swing state and you've already voted, that's one less voter contact that they have to make sure that they get them to the polls. So, yes, this is a very important thing and a very important metric that we're going to be watching over the next few weeks to see where the early vote is coming from. Is it coming from precincts that Trump won or that Biden won 4 years ago? Are they coming from registered Republicans or Democrats? That's going to be something that both of the campaigns are going to be watching very closely over the next few weeks.
Gregory, hang on for a second. We do want to mention a headline that's crossed the Bloomberg that's impacting shares of NVIDIA, which are down about 3%. Beijing is stepping up pressures on Chinese companies to buy locally produced artificial intelligence chips instead of NVIDIA products, part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. So Chinese regulators have been discouraging companies from purchasing NVIDIA's H20 chips, which are used to develop and run AI models. This is according to people familiar with the matter. The policy has taken the form of guidance rather than an outright ban, as Beijing wants to avoid handicapping its own AI startups and escalating tensions with the United States, said those who are familiar and asked not to be identified because the matter is private. But Tim, we have had so much news coming out of China more broadly in terms of stimulus efforts, but this is interesting in terms of, maybe not surprising, China, once again looking to protect a domestic industry.
Yeah, the move designed to help domestic Chinese AI chip makers gain more market share while preparing local tech companies for any potential additional U.S. restrictions, the People said. NVIDIA shares down 3.7%.
We should point out, too, that the U.S. government banned NVIDIA from selling its most advanced AI processors to China customers back in 2022, so about 2 years ago. That was part of an attempt to really limit Beijing's technological advances. So, we know the war that's been out there, the tech war, and in particular when it comes to advanced semiconductors.
Hey, Gregory, I want to bring you back in on this conversation and go back to the latest Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll that shows Kamala Harris with this razor tight edge when it comes to these swing states that you've been following and Morning Consult and Bloomberg News have been following for months throughout the election, even before Harris was the nominee at this point. Give us an idea of contextually where this poll fits in with other polls, because I know oftentimes the important thing to do is to take polls against other polls and understand where it fits in sort of holistically.
No, that's a very good question. Look, as I've told you before, we're very proud of this collaboration we have with Morning Consult. It's a poll that we do in the swing states. We have a good sample size, and importantly, we get to ask the questions like the ones I've been talking about. Which candidate do you trust more on these basic economic issues, which help us to understand what's driving the race. But the number that everybody wants to pay attention to at this point in the race, which is very understandable, is that top line horse race, who's winning kind of number. And the polls are actually very accurate, but as we get a race this close, even a few points of margin of error can make the difference between who's winning and who's losing. And so one of the ways that we compensate for that is we take all of the polls that are out there, the good ones, the bad ones, the recent ones, the little less recent ones. We throw them into an algorithm. There are a number of people who do this. Real Clear Politics, 538 are the most prominent, and they average them. And that sort of cancels out any methodological differences you have in different polls, any house effects. Some polls tend to skew more Democratic, some more Republican. Our poll, as I've looked at it, the 12 months that we've been doing it, 7 months it's been to the Democratic side of the average, 5 months it's been to the Republican side of the average. So mostly down the middle, but you know the averages do help us to sort of cancel out a lot of that noise and find the signal. And on those, again, it's a very, very close race. The Vice President Harris seems to be pulling into a national lead, but historically, Democrats have to overperform nationally to be competitive in these swing states. And so as we turn to the battleground states, we really have to take it state by state from here on out to kind of understand where the campaign is going.
As we get closer to the election, do those polls become more exact, more telling, or not necessarily?
As I said, the undecideds tend to fall away, and the other thing that's changed is that we're starting to look not just at registered voters, but we ask, are you likely to vote? And so we look more towards likely voters. Sometimes pollsters will go to those undecideds and push them even further to say, I know you said undecided, but are you leaning one way or the other now? So there's different methods that pollsters have as we get closer to the election to really try to figure out where the race is going. But remember, the easy part of polling is to sample a large number of people and tell them who they intend to vote for. The hardest part is to figure out which of those people you sampled is actually going to show up. And that can depend on factors like the weather on election day or just sort of how people feeling, the extent of the enthusiasm, whether there's an October surprise. All of these are factors that are sort of unknowable. Here we are 6 months or 6 weeks away from the election. As we get closer,
soon.
Theory, hopefully, it's already been the longest election in history.
The next 6 weeks, I guarantee you,
longer.
Gregory, will feel like 6 months, no question.
It's been an
I don't have the app that Carol has, but I just live this, so I can tell you. If you want to know the hours and minutes and days, I can tell you.
I know. I hear you. Gregory Cordy, Bloomberg News Senior White House and Politics Correspondent. Coming up, we're watching shares of NVIDIA. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about Climate Week. That was.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Beijing is stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced artificial intelligence chips instead of NVIDIA products, all part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. NVIDIA shares, they are lower now by 3.5%. It is a down day for the S&P 500 index, down by about 0.3%. Even with today's losses, stocks are on track for their third consecutive week of gains, despite languishing today as investors were repeatedly reassured that the U.S. economy is cooling without falling off a cliff. We've got the Dow up 109, now up by 0.3%. NASDAQ lower by 0.6%. The Russell 2000 small cap shares advancing up 0.4%. 10-year 3.74%, the 2-year 3.55%. Gold now down 1%, 26.46 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude gaining on Middle East tensions, now at 68.31 a barrel. WTI up today by 1%. So again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow higher, S&P right now down 15, a decline of 0.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much.
You know what you missed this week?
I missed a lot. Gridlock in the city here.
You're getting still a little bit of it.
You know, I took the subway this morning, and police officers at every corner still.
Yeah.
Thanks, UN General Assembly.
Yeah, it's been busy.
I was talking to the cab driver last night on my way home, and he was complaining about it. And I said, you know what? I think every year at this time, I'm going to try to be out of the city because it's just... He said, forget about it. That's what he said. I was like, okay, I'm back in New York.
You didn't go, forget about it.
I'm back in New York.
You are. It was Climate Week here in New York City. We've had, though, a lot of guests on air this week talking about it. And as a reminder, in terms of the mission to combat climate change, renewable energy goals were set at last year's UN Climate Summit in Dubai to triple global renewable energy capacity, Tim, by 2030. So that's kind of the end
game.
Did
I say UN General Assembly? That's what I missed?
Yeah. Why?
Okay, I just want to make sure people outside of New York understand what we're talking about.
Oh,
the whole city shuts down.
Yeah.
President Biden was here earlier this week. You saw him.
At the Bloomberg event, he was there. Yeah.
So it's like you can't get anywhere.
No.
On the east side.
No. Okay, yeah. So we had a lot of leaders in town. They're working on those big climate goals. They've also got a full plate, it's safe to say. And our next guest actually says that, once again, we're living in unprecedented levels or through unprecedented levels of uncertainty and change, and this year is no different. So this is what leaders have to deal with.
Yeah, we got with us Rich Lesser. He's global chair of BCG, Boston Consulting Group. He joins us from New York. He's got a view on the week that was, the conversations that were had around climate change and more. Rich, good to have you back with us. Before we get to the solutions, just give us an idea of what you experienced this week during Climate Week and sort of how these conversations were different than last year. Of course, all of this happening under the intense backdrop of a tropical storm that has killed 20 people at least as of last count.
Yeah, so... First, I think we can't ignore that. I mean, I would describe this year as pretty sober on the conversations that took place for multiple reasons. One, there was this looming massive hurricane that's hit, late last night and is already wreaking havoc across multiple states in the South with death and massive amounts of destruction. And, it's largely as a result of the extraordinarily high heat in the Gulf and how that affects storms and the intensity of storms. I think you also have a backdrop of, an increasing recognition of how far off track we are to the 1.5 to 2 degree world we've been talking about. Talked to multiple people who now are sadly, but increasingly believing that we're on a path to 2.5 to 3 degrees, not 1.5 to 2 degrees. That has massive implications. Basically, however bad it was to get to the storms of yesterday and today, we're talking about twice the heat intensity is on the path we're heading toward. And I think that's pretty scary. I think third, obviously, there's a backdrop of just how politically divisive this has become. That obviously makes it harder. And then fourth, AI, which is going to do so much good in so many parts of the world, obviously is creating massive load on power. And I think putting increased pressure on our goals to decarbonize the economy. So you put all those things together, it's not that we're not making progress. It's not that people don't care. There were tons of discussions I thought were quite energizing, actually, and listening to what people are trying to do. But I do think that backdrop is pretty sober.
Actions speak louder than words. So, I understand the conversations that we've been having for many years around this as we start to, as we can increasingly see the damage of climate change grow, and also as the Earth's surface warms up. So having said that, where are people in terms of actions? I think Tim and I we laugh, but it's not funny in terms of these goals. And we're like, okay, that's 5 years from now. That's 6 years from now. I mean, what's the environment going to be by then? So is there an urgency, do you feel like, among leaders, global leaders, to actually maybe do things sooner rather than later?
Well, look, you really have to, it's always dangerous to put everybody into one bucket, but I think on this topic, that's particularly true. We have a range of views, both among political leaders in the public sector and in the private sector. I would say a lot of the folks who come to Climate Week, who are here this week, are genuinely committed and are taking action. And even some of the recent announcements from the big tech firms to push further on nuclear, to find other ways to access renewable or low carbon energy resources are signs of the seriousness. The problem is the sum of the individually responsible actors isn't close to the amount of progress that we need. And so I think you're back to saying, like, what do we do to drive systemic change at the pace that we require? And again, I'm not minimizing each of us who want to make a difference to walk the walk ourselves, but it's also how we work together to do that. And I thought a lot of the more interesting discussions this week, whether it was about dealing with the risks associated with a much hotter world, what we'll have to do on adaptation, whether it's about how do we get more creative to source low carbon power in a world of AI, whether it's about how to get the people in the upstream parts of supply chains who are making massive investments able to get those products sold downstream in supply chains, things like chemicals or cement or steel or other products. I think that's the kind of problems we need to solve together.
What about incentives, though? And I think about this from the perspective of covering companies every quarter when they report their results, and the idea that investors care about the top line, they care about the bottom line for the current quarter and the previous quarter, and the outlook, of course. Do the incentives actually match with decisions that companies are making to maximize profits for investors?
Well, first of all, what we really want, if you think about your investors, they're looking at earnings, and then they're looking on the multiple on those future earnings, which is the long-term prospects for those businesses to be winning businesses and successful. And so that's about sustainable longer-term value creation, not just about the next quarter. And one can argue in a world that is heating up the way this world is heating up, and where societal pressures are only going to grow over time, that building robust businesses that can offer great products to their customers that are with lower carbon footprints is going to be key to a sustainable future. But of course, we can talk about the long term. We still do need to talk about the short term. And there, I think we are seeing some things that are having impact. IRA uptake is occurring. Frankly, the things getting in the way of IRA are often things like permitting or other rules that slow things down. But that money is meaningful. I think I heard today that we're close to $80 billion deployed on IRA out of the 380 that was approved. So money is moving, but it's not moving as fast as it needs to. The things that Europe is doing around carbon border adjustment mechanisms, energy trading systems are having impact. Japan's looking to put in new systems for emissions trading systems that I think will help.
Hey, Rich,
so I would say it's having impact, just not fast enough.
Rich, one of our guests that we've had during Climate Week here and with all the global leaders in town is someone who's written a book on kind of looking at Earth's surface, looking at the history, what we can learn in terms of combating and slowing climate change. Having said that, the issue of the fossil fuel energy and the lobbying and its existence continues to be an issue. Their view, I just wanted to put it out, got 30 seconds. As long as we are still so reliant on fossil fuels, it's going to be pretty tough, this fight.
Sure. I mean, look, we only have two paths. One path is reduce, and that is reducing largely the use of fossil fuels. And one path is remove emissions that are in the air, whether it's in concentrated streams in a cement plant or a steel plant, put that carbon back in the ground, or remove carbon from the atmosphere, or use biological solutions. We have to reduce and remove both.
Going to leave it there. Hey, listen, thank you so much. So appreciate it. Rich Lesser, Global Chair of BCG, joining us here. That was the week that was with Climate Week. We're going to get into the trading week, the week that was. That's next.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, time for a... I told you, like,
it's Friday.
What is with me? Okay, you know what it is? I stayed up late watching Emily in Paris, the new
how is
season.
it?
It's good.
I haven't seen the first season.
We'll talk later. We'll talk later. We got to talk about trading.
All right, it's time now for Options Insight. Here's Abigail Doolittle. She's with Scott Bauer, CEO at Prosper Trading Academy. Hey, Abigail.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much. And Scott, great to have you with us, especially from the floor of SIBO. That's really pretty cool to see you down there. And speaking of SIBO, the VIX right now, it had been in the red, and now it's in the green. And I'm wondering if it has to do with this headline we've seen over the last half hour or so, that China is urging local companies to stay away from NVIDIA's AI chips. That stock now down 3%. And of course, the biggest weighting or third biggest weighting to the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. So as goes NVIDIA, goes the market. Is that a part of why the VIX is popping higher right now?
It certainly is. And what's unbelievable, Abigail, is right after that news came out, and literally about 5 minutes ago behind me, after a day that was, pretty dull, two huge spreads came into the pit. One of them was an October-November 25 call spread, with paper or retail coming in and buying that call spread over 100,000 times. And then we also saw another one on the 28 strike line. So all of a sudden, after not much happening here and a lot of complacency in the marketplace, all of a sudden you've got buyers coming in So, could that have coincided right with that, China news and NVIDIA? It's very likely that that happened.
Well, Scott, you mentioned October, November call spread on the VIX 25 and then 28. Not only is that significantly higher than where we are now, suggesting that some investors are either hedging or do think that markets are going to be volatile to the downside then. But that, of course, straddles the election. So, it's interesting because, of course, this week for China, there's been a lot of stimulus and then China coming out urging local companies to not buy NVIDIA. I'm wondering if it's strategic and somehow around the election. Can you make some sort of tie-in there?
Sure. So what's really interesting is the last VIX really that will expire prior to the election is the October one. So that one is really the election premium. The November VIX that's been buying, that expires after the election, about a week or two afterwards. So if you look at the VIX futures curve, we do see a significant pop from where we are right now going to October, and that remains fairly steady to November. So these two particular trades that happened here, this is looking for some moves possibly post-election, actually giving it another couple weeks after the election until those November options expire.
Well, that makes sense, actually, relative to NVIDIA, because it's hard to believe, but yes, just in next week or the 2 weeks, the earnings season starts back up again. But NVIDIA, of course, is a month after the other big tech names. So I believe that they'll be at the end of November. So somebody may be hedging the overall S&P 500 around that. But even though NVIDIA is a massive driver of markets, it's not the only driver. We also have the Fed. What else is on your radar? And in terms of VIX at 16, is that where you want to see it in an election year with so much economic uncertainty? Well, I would say more geopolitical uncertainty and some uncertainty around the bifurcated consumer, and some thinking, that there could be some economic weakness ahead.
From a mathematical standpoint, a VIX of 16 suggests a movement of about 1% in the S&P's daily, which is about what we've been seeing. But again, there has been a lot of complacency, and I think there's too much complacency. I personally am surprised that we're not seeing VIX higher, though again, when we look at the futures curve going out to where the VIX futures are that would incorporate the election, we are seeing it significantly higher, around 18.5 to 19. Now, these trades that came in today using the 25, 28 strike, that is higher, but I am really surprised we're not seeing it higher. And my guess is once we turn the clock September 30th on Monday, we get into a new quarter and it's October, we are going to see a higher VIX, in my opinion.
So, Scott, we have about a minute or so left here, and I'm thinking about that VIX spike. And I should actually mention for our viewers and our listeners, the VIX, of course, is that volatility index. It measures uncertainty. Back in early August, when we were within that yen carry trade unwind that caused so much volatility because cheap liquidity was coming out of the system, causing risk assets to really get rattled, that VIX went almost as high as 70. Could you see anything like that happening again by the end of the year?
I mean, I'm not going to discount that, but that is really like a 3 standard deviation move. That is really a market outlier to see something like that. And, if we look to see where that VIX spike was back in early August, that lasted literally for about 30 minutes. So it is very, very, very small possibility, but it is definitely not out of the question. I could see VIX trading back into the mid-20s and even a 30 handle, though, coming up, prior to the election.
Well, I'm sure if you see any of those signs, you'll be emailing me, as you do, with great trading signals. Thanks so much, Scott Bauer, CEO of Prosper Trading Academy. Tim and Carol, back to you.
All right, good stuff as always. Abigail, thank you so much. You guys talked about NVIDIA, still down about 3%, was down almost 4% at its lows. Again, that Bloomberg exclusive about Beijing stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products. So this is according to those familiar. So we'll keep an eye. We're going to have more in the next hour on that.
Yeah, we're not just going to be talking NVIDIA. Also, we're going to be talking Intel, speaking of chips, a little later. And then, Carol, she's America's government teacher.
This is cool stuff.
Yeah, she's interviewed the VP. That's next on Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just 60 minutes away from wrapping up the trading week. I mean, one day for you.
I was going to say, is this how it works? It's a one-day trading week?
Oh, that it were true.
Yeah, sorry.
Talk about volume. Could you imagine if it was just one trading day?
I'm
hey, folks,
imagining.
Tell us how you feel. One day.
What happened to the 4-day work week?
What happened to the 4-day work week?
All we
4-day
need
trading week, anyone?
I think, the sad part is we're going in the opposite direction.
I know. Well,
with companies offering 24/7 trading.
Yeah. Well, my point is you can trade around the clock. So like, I'm just saying.
So then only have the markets open 4 days a week.
I'll do a 10, 12-hour day. Oh, wait, I do a 10, 12-hour day. I'm just kidding. It is Friday, as we like to say. It is Friday, September 27th. Getting through those last few days of September in terms of trading. We're watching the market here. Coming up over the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about a tale of two chip companies. One's been hot, one has not. And we're going to hear from NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. We've got that story on Bloomberg that's putting pressure on that stock today. We're also going to get an update on the latest interested party in Intel.
Yeah, so we got a lot coming up with chips in just a few minutes. Also, at least 20 people have been killed, millions more without power in the wake of Hurricane Helene. Our Bloomberg opinion columnist connects the dots when it comes to climate change and powerful storms.
And you mentioned America's government teacher. She interviewed VP Harris right before President Joe Biden dropped out. She's got a new book out. We're going to get into it with Sharon McMahon. She's going to join us a little bit later on. But we're going to get a check on what's going on here in the trade.
Yeah, here's Charlie Pellet keeping an eye on everything. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed. Welcome back, Tim. We have got stocks trading mixed right now. 50 minutes to go, 59 minutes until we wrap up this trading week with the Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ, both in the red right now with the S&P down 1 point. Little change there. S&P at 57.43, on track for a winning week. As a matter of fact, third consecutive week of gains on the S&P. The Dow higher by 216, up by about 0.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 68, a decline of 0.4%. 10-year yield at 3.75% with a 2-year 3.56%. Spot gold down $26 the ounce at $26.46, down by 1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.8%. 68.22 for a barrel of WTI. As for the interest rate backdrop, Lauren Goodwin is Chief Market Strategist at New York Life Investment Management.
The real question for investors now is that if the Fed is still restrictive, which I think with 50 basis points off the top they still are, do incremental cuts from here make enough difference to reaccelerate the economy?
Goodwin was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television's Open Interest. Again, the 10-year right now at 3.75%. Some of the other stories that we are following for you today: Beijing stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products, all part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. NVIDIA shares tumbling today by 3.2%. We're on it. Story will have a lot more for you coming up right here on Bloomberg Business Week. So again, recapping, little change for the U.S. equity market as we head toward the closing bell. S&P right now down 1 point. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We've got two names in the semi-space that are on our radar today. And Tim, we do want to start with NVIDIA.
Yeah, shares were already down before this headline that crossed just about 30 minutes ago. Beijing is stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products. It's part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. It's about protecting the industry in China.
Absolutely. This is something that's the Chinese playbook, certainly has been as of late. Hey, prior to that headline, though, Bloomberg News reporter Tyler Kendall caught up with the NVIDIA president, CEO, and co-founder Jensen Huang in Washington, D.C. So we're so delighted to have Tyler with us. So tell us, first of all, Tyler, set the scene. Where was he? Where you caught up with him? Because it sounds like it was like a little doorstepping there.
Yeah, exactly. I had the chance to catch up with the NVIDIA CEO, Jensen Huang, today in Washington, D.C. He was here for a private meeting, and we were able to stop him on his way into that meeting and ask him about some things that are ending up to be pretty newsy, right? As you've been covering that headline that just broke on the terminal about China trying to counter these U.S. export controls, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence and chips. I had the chance to ask him if he felt that these export controls were effective, and it was pretty interesting. His answer, he was trying to kind of thread the needle there, right? Saying that the U.S. government is doing its best to balance what is national security concerns, but also the interests of American companies.
Well, we have to defer all of the policy making to the administration. They understand that the balancing national security versus the prosperity of American technology all over the world.
Now, of course, the U.S. banned NVIDIA from selling its most advanced AI chips to China in 2022. And this has been part of the Biden administration's work to try to protect U.S. technology and particularly this competition.
Interesting. I love that you were able to ask this question even before this news came out. That was pretty brilliant, Tyler. You also talked a little bit about AI and the chips and the data centers necessary to power it all. They, of course, use a ton of energy. We've been talking about this. Oh, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, big topic.
Was this Climate Week? You guys talked about this a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely came up because AI is such a big part of, or it seems to be a growing part of everything we're doing. And
getting a nuclear power plant back online.
And I think about the story that we just talked about over the last week or so about Microsoft and Constellation Energy and 3 Mile Island, coming back online, at least part of it, because it's data centers and AI.
Yeah. So Tyler, what did Jensen talk to you about when it came to energy usage and AI?
Exactly. I actually brought up that exact example, this recent deal between Microsoft and Constellation Energy to use nuclear power to power Microsoft's AI energy grid. And I asked him if he felt that nuclear energy could be the way forward when it comes to NVIDIA and their needs for energy and a bigger infrastructure grid to support their technology.
Nuclear is a wonderful way forward as one of the sources of energy, one of the sources of sustainable energy. It won't be the only one. We're going to need energy from all sources and balance the availability and the cost of energy as well as the sustainability over time.
Now, this has been a big topic here in Washington. I'd point you that the NVIDIA CEO was actually at the White House earlier this month, along with a whole other host of AI executives. They had a private meeting at the White House with some pretty senior Biden administration officials, including Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, to talk about just this, the need to boost both the energy grid and also infrastructure needs when it comes to supporting artificial intelligence, whether that's data centers or chip production. I'd quickly point you to a recent Goldman Sachs analysis which found that data center energy is growing exponentially, partly because of what they're calling this AI revolution. They estimate that energy consumption from data centers is going to go up 160% by 2030, and leaders like NVIDIA CEO are urging these investments in energy and infrastructure needs to support what's this growing demand.
Hey, any thoughts on the upcoming election? I know anybody who runs a publicly held company is so careful, Tyler, but I'm just curious if anything came out.
So I did ask him if he's been in touch with either of the campaigns, considering that he has made this recent visit to the White House. He told me that he has not, and that he trusts that no matter who wins the White House next, he's going to work with that administration on all things related to AI.
And no leather jacket.
Yeah, what's
today?
up with that?
You go to Washington, D.C., you wear a suit. If you're Jensen Huang, what's going on?
I have to say, it was pouring rain. It was nice enough that he stopped and talked to me on the sidewalk there, but I'm not sure if a leather jacket would have done so well in the weather today in Washington.
He's a Californian, so he doesn't have to, he's not used to the rain, Carol.
Yeah, well, I mean, right? What is this stuff coming down? Pretty amazing. Hey, listen, great catch, and so timely considering the Bloomberg exclusive, and certainly NVIDIA is a company that we talk about, I gotta say, on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
So the things that are going on, whether it's AI or NVIDIA specific. So kudos. Tyler Kendall, there in DC, news reporter here at Bloomberg News. We're gonna stay with the semi-sector.
Let's do it. And, we've talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, but also, Carol, over the last few months, because it's been a slow-moving but very significant story when it comes to this chip space. There's a lot of parties out there, Qualcomm, Apollo Global, now ARM Holdings, who just in the past week or so have reportedly been interested in none other than Intel. As for the latest, Intel telling ARM, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, right. ARM Holdings approached Intel about potentially buying the ailing chip maker's product division, only to be told that the businesses, or that business in particular, is not for sale. That's according to a person with direct knowledge of the matter. So a lot swirling around continues to be when it comes to Intel. So let's see what our Bloomberg Intelligence senior technology industry analyst Mandeep Singh has to say all about it. He joins us from New York City. Mandeep, good to have you here. I also do want to ask you, we want to ask you a little bit about NVIDIA, if we may, but Intel, ARM, why would they be interested, and why would Intel say, thanks, but no thanks?
I mean, right now, I think everyone is looking at Intel and saying, what is it that they would want to sell? And pretty much put a bid out there. I think that's why Qualcomm was interested. And in the case of ARM, which is a much smaller company, I mean, they design the IP blocks. They're not a chip designer or, a fab manufacturer. So much smaller in revenue run rate. But clearly, Intel has a lot of patents and IP related to chip design that ARM may possibly be interested in here.
And what would they do with it that would be more successful than what Intel could do on its own? How could they turn that business around, Mandeep?
I mean, right now, think of it this way. Intel has got its hands in too many things in terms of trying to turn around the ship. An IP design business requires a ton of R&D. And Intel has an architecture called x86. That's been the mode for that business on the CPU side for the past 30 years. ARM clearly dominates on the smartphone side with their architecture. And there are some adjacencies for ARM. So like FPGA, which is a business that Intel acquired back in 2016, the Altera business. That's one example. But in the case of semiconductor design, there are a number of IP blocks and patents that these companies have developed over the years. And Intel, I mean, in the past 30 years has a lot of patents like that a design company like ARM may be interested in acquiring so that it helps expand their business. I mean, ARM isn't getting into, a fabulous design to compete with the likes of NVIDIA or Apple, because those are the customers that use ARM design. So the way they have to look to expand is through IP blocks. And that's where I think Intel is a company that's got everything, something for everyone, and that's why every company is looking at it closely.
A semi-buffet, you might say. Hey, is there a match, Mandeep, that you think Intel would say yes to when it comes to a buyout offer or some kind of M&A deal, likely an acquisition deal?
Not with ARM. I would be very surprised if they do any sort of transaction with ARM, simply because that's Intel's mode. I mean, I know.
But anybody else? Anybody else, like another company where Intel would say, yeah, go ahead.
Qualcomm was quite interesting. I mean, Qualcomm clearly has, a very different business than ARM in the sense that they are a big player on the smartphone side, but they don't compete at the architecture level with Intel. And, a Qualcomm Intel merger would be a merger of equals. ARM is a much smaller company than Intel. I mean, even though ARM's market cap is 50% above Intel right now, but they're much smaller in terms of the scope. So Qualcomm Intel is a merger of equals, although even with that transaction, I would say Qualcomm would want to divest at least the foundry side of it. That's the main area that Intel has really struggled with, because right now the optics are really bad. If you want to build your foundry business from an Intel perspective, none of these large players are willing to give you their designs because Intel is a competitor to them. So why would an Amazon or an Apple or Qualcomm use Intel Foundry when they know Intel is a potential competitor on that server side? And that's where they have had their challenges, along with the process node. Clearly, their process nodes are not equivalent to TSMC's and their costs are higher, but it's just customers are not willing to give away their designs to Intel because of the competitive aspect.
Mandeep, just one more on Intel, and then we're going to go and talk NVIDIA with you because we got a little bit of time left. What does Intel do as a standalone company moving forward if it indeed remains a standalone company in this structure?
I mean, they just have to prioritize the areas you want to focus on. You can't turn around all these different problems they are dealing with on the foundry side, on the chip design side, trailing NVIDIA on the AI server side. So to me, the Intel's real cash cow business is their PC business. They got to prep for that big refresh cycle. If this AI wave is real and it's multi-year, there will be a big PC refresh cycle. You got to make sure that Intel is not losing share to AMD or anyone else on the PC side. And then on the server side, I mean, look, hyperscalers are looking to diversify beyond NVIDIA. That's where Intel x86 is still, the dominant architecture, although it's losing share to ARM. But that's where they have to focus on improving that side of the business. The foundry side is where I think it'll be a lot more challenging, and that's where you need more investments, $10 billion, and they are getting subsidized by the government. But that to me is the more challenging part than the PC and the server side.
Hey, Mandeep, would love for you to weigh in on what is now among, if not the most read story on the Bloomberg terminal, which has to do with a Bloomberg exclusive about China urging local companies to stay away from NVIDIA's chips. So particularly to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA's products, according to those familiar with this. How do you, I don't know, is this just more of the back and forth and the tensions between the U.S. and China, especially about the semi sector, or is there something more here?
I mean, this has been, I think this is not entirely new, but what it puts focus on is the fact that, in China, even though these companies are developing their own large language models equivalent to GPT and Anthropic and Google, they are looking to reduce their reliance on NVIDIA chips. I mean, right now, every company in the U.S. Is training their large language models on NVIDIA. And that's why, NVIDIA is doing so well. Over there, even though they're not getting the latest chips, they're trying to keep up with the pace of Gen AI development, at the same time reduce their reliance when it comes to using the latest chips from NVIDIA. And they have their own fab, the SMIC. They have their own fabless companies, Huawei and all the other companies that are doing the design. And they want to build that. I mean, they're not going to catch up overnight, but clearly that's their long-term plan, is to use their own fabs, use their own chip companies, and then develop their own large language models that are trained on, the chips that are made domestically.
All right, going to leave it on that. Hey, Mandeep, thank you so much. Enjoy the weekend. Mandeep Singh, Senior Tech Industry Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us there in New York City. Just checking out shares of NVIDIA. They were down prior to this Bloomberg exclusive, but again, they've definitely deepened some of their losses, but off their lows. They're still down about 3% here, Tim.
Yeah, looking at the function on the Bloomberg terminal to see where they fell to today, down 3.85%, just in the wake of that report, now down 3.1%.
Keeping an eye on that, that's for sure.
It's one of my decliners, Carol.
I was assuming
I changed it up.
I was assuming.
That's why you got to wait until the last minute, because there's always news.
We always get caught. We make a plan, and then it's like, wait, we got to add these. Hey, coming up, everybody, on Bloomberg Business Week, healthcare priorities ahead of the U.S. presidential election from one group that continues to see lots of stress. That story next on Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. 39 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Stocks on track for their third week of gains on rate bets. We have got the S&P 500 index, though, languishing today, down 2 points, down less than 0.1%. We'll call that a little change. Dow Industrials right now up by about 201 points, up by just about 0.5%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 65, a decline there of 0.4%. We've got the 10-year at 3.74%, the 2-year 3.56%. Spot gold down $22 the ounce now, $26.49, down 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up just about 0.9%, 68.28 for a barrel of WTI. Beijing stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products, all part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. NVIDIA shares today, they are tumbling by 3.2%, all part of a broader tech sell-off. Again, recapping here, S&P down 2 points, a drop there of just about 0.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. Carol, think back to September 10th.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm with you.
It was the presidential debate.
Yeah.
Can you believe that? This month? It was only a few weeks ago.
It was
but
only a few weeks ago.
I know.
Okay.
But in the frenetic world of presidential campaigns, it kind of feels like ancient history, doesn't it?
It does, very much so.
Okay, it was at that debate that Trump said that he had, quote, concepts of a plan after criticizing the Affordable Care Act of 2010. It was designed to make affordable health insurance available to more people. Needless to say, the phrase immediately became the source of online memes, poking fun at the response. I'm bringing this up because healthcare is a top issue for voters this year. That's according to a report this month from the Pew Research Center.
It's interesting, right? Because we talk about so often what really matters to voters. We talk about the economy and so on, but healthcare, I mean, I think about the conversations we have.
Yeah.
We're worried about whether or not there will be enough healthcare workers as people age.
Well, what's interesting is that, according to Pew, it's Harris voters who have health care as a priority, the Supreme Court and abortion, more so than Trump voters.
All right, so let's get into it. For more on all of this, we bring a voice that has really been a go-to voice for us about what's going on more broadly in healthcare, but really also during the height of the pandemic. Back with us is Dr. Iman Abuzaid, co-founder and CEO of the nursing talent platform Incredible Health, which connects nurses and hospitals. She is joining us from Austin, Texas. Great to have you back with us. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about the election, the outcome, and what it means for those folks that you represent and work with.
So elections, of course, are important. They dominate news cycles, but we also have to realize that healthcare workforce policy is shaped at the federal level, the state level, and with local policies too, plus licensing boards as well. So we, at Incredible Health, we have this vision and mission of helping healthcare professionals live better lives and helping them find and do their best work. And we have over 1 million nurses in our community, and we work with over 1,500 hospitals. So something we did earlier this month is that we launched our healthcare policy navigator for nurses. And it's a tool designed to empower nurses and healthcare leaders to not only stay informed on these policies that matter for them, but also influence them too.
So which one is the most important? You mentioned licensing boards, you mentioned local, federal, state.
Yeah.
What's sort of most important in your world?
So honestly, all areas are important, both federal, state, and local. We very much focused on 3 key topics when we built out the healthcare policy navigator for nurses. The first is nurse mental health and well-being. The second is educational support for nurses. And then the third is workplace safety and violence. And so in all 3 of those areas, there are both federal, state, local, and licensing board factors to consider. For example, when it comes to educational support for nurses, there is the Stop Nurse Shortages Act and the Future Advancement of Academic Nursing Act, which aim to expand nursing programs and increase clinical training opportunities for nurses.
Well, and I do wonder, and that's good to hear, but you know how it goes, right, in administration, and how the economy goes will certainly impact what kind of priorities an administration has. What hope do you have, especially when it comes to the nursing community, but more broadly, the healthcare community, being front and center for whoever ends up in the White House?
So I think, you know, both of you have discussed this many times on your program as well, but our healthcare workforce is not big enough to keep up with the demand from the U.S. population. You know, our Americans are aging. There's more and more strain on the healthcare system, and we're not keeping up with the number of workers needed to fulfill that demand. It is the biggest labor shortages we have in this country, which is why it's such a critical issue for legislators to pay attention to.
Are nurses not getting paid enough? Because as Mike McGlone on our Bloomberg Commodities team from Bloomberg Intelligence says, the cure for high prices is high prices, i.e. the idea that if there's demand for something but not enough supply, the price for that will go up until it doesn't.
So he's absolutely right, and we've seen wages increase for nurses consistently every single year for the last 10 years, and that I don't think there's any end in sight in wage increases for nurses because of the labor shortage. However, there are significant challenges happening in the workplace that are putting additional strain on them too, like workplace safety and violence, like the need for improved mental health and well-being for nurses too.
One thing I want to ask you though, wages, are they going up for nurses in hospitals? Are they going up in private nursing care? I'm just curious, is it across the board?
It's actually across the board, and it's not just for the wages are increases not just for nurses, but for all the healthcare professions.
Interesting.
The other area I want to mention is just when it comes to nurse mental health and well-being, we have to make sure we don't lose the workforce that we already have. And so the Dr. Lorna Breen Healthcare Provider Protection Act, for example, helps improve access and reduce the stigma of mental health treatment for healthcare workers, and encourages nurses to put pressure on their licensing boards to remove questions about mental health, to really reduce the stigma when it comes to just getting their licenses.
You've mentioned something that I don't believe you've mentioned in the past in interviews with us, Dr. Abuzaid, and that's the idea of, I believe you used the term workplace violence.
Yeah, so in one of our recent reports, because we publish reports every few months, indicated that 1 in 2 nurses in the U.S. has been verbally or physically assaulted by a patient or a member of the patient's family in the last year. Wow. And we've seen we've seen an increase in workplace safety and violence from patients against nurses in the last couple of years. And so that puts another strain, pressure, stress on this workforce. And so there's more that we can do to address that, like the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act calls on really implementing violence prevention plans within healthcare settings.
Is it making a difference?
I think the difference is happening locally already. We interact with over 1,500 hospitals across the U.S., and those health system leaders are implementing zero tolerance policies. They're replacing security guards with police in emergency departments in some cases, and really increasing the amount of support that they're providing to nurses that are experiencing this assault. But more is needed, especially from legislators, both locally and at the state level, to get this down.
Is this a relatively new phenomenon in the sense that, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we saw a lot of incidents, a lot of increase in incidents on airlines, for example, of
physical,
customers acting out in a way that I at least hadn't heard about before the pandemic. Is this a new phenomenon, or have these healthcare professionals been dealing with this widely? We just don't have the data. We just didn't have the data before.
They have been dealing with it for a long time, but it certainly got worse as a result of the pandemic. There's something about what happened in the pandemic just sort of increased, and the American perception of how, or changed American perception of healthcare workers. And there was a lot of frustration, right, around vaccine mandates, around the way COVID policies were handled, and some of that was, that was exacerbated for the healthcare workforce. There was like retaliation almost against the healthcare workforce.
It's interesting. I always think about when we have a conversation with you or individuals in a certain sector where there are certainly a lot of things that could maybe be better. If there's one thing you could change, because it sounds like there's getting some legislation to protect the nursing community. If there's one thing you could change, what would it be?
Honestly, the one thing I would do is I would encourage nurses and healthcare workers to be the solution as well. And specifically, I think when nurses vote and other healthcare workers vote, healthcare will improve, and their workplaces will improve. So I definitely would, highly recommend nurses, register to vote and get involved civically as well, because these policies can improve their working conditions.
That's interesting. This is not something that I'd thought about, Carol, when it comes to healthcare professionals.
Oh, you mean the abuse and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, when I first heard Dr. Abuzaid say it, I thought it was dealing with coworkers. But
Right.
I guess, now that she brings it up, patients, families, people who are experiencing care, who might react that way.
There's stressful situations. You feel like, your loved one isn't being taken care of. What I thought was also interesting, Dr. Abuzaid, what you said is, you're encouraging, the nursing community to be a part of the solution, and that includes voting. Do they vote? Do we know? Do you have any feeling about whether or not they feel like their vote matters?
Yeah, the data we have shows that nurses and healthcare workers more broadly vote 10% less than the rest of the U.S. population, actually.
Wow.
So they're actually less civically engaged than other groups of workers. So that's definitely something that we want to change.
Do we know why?
We actually don't. It's not very well understood.
Wow. Could be also, a lot of healthcare workers have some really odd hours. I have a family member who was a nurse. I mean, sometimes you go in at midnight, or like your shifts can be kind of a little crazy. So maybe it's a case of when it's on election day, you're like, I'm exhausted, I'm going to sleep.
What do we know about...
Which I understand, yeah.
What do we know, Dr. Abuzaid? What do your data tell us about immigrants and nurses and healthcare workers, and to what extent the profession attracts immigrants?
Yeah, the profession absolutely attracts immigrants. I think 20% of the U.S. nurse workforce was not born in the U.S. And so we are definitely net importers of nurses from other countries. And even with all of that, it's still not. We're still dealing with a shortage. Still not enough to meet the demands of the U.S. population. So yeah, the immigrants are a critical group.
I hate to say it, but
and it has been challenging to get more nurses into the U.S. because of our immigration policies. And I think both parties have challenging immigration policies that prevent more healthcare workers from entering the country.
I was going to say, I hate to say it, but you do wonder whether there's some kind of robotic component that comes in when it comes to some of the simpler nursing tasks, if that's even possible. You just do wonder about the way forward, because there's just not going to be enough in the future. Dr. Iman Abuzaid, thank you so much. Be well, be well. Have a good weekend. Co-founder, CEO of the nursing talent platform Incredible Health, joining us from Austin, Texas. We got about 26 minutes to go.
Yeah, we're up for the week 0.7% on the S&P 500. Carol, seeing a little bit of red on the screen for the S&P 500. It's down fractionally right now. The NASDAQ Composite down 0.4%, but the Dow in the green, up 0.5 percentage point.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting kind of mellow mode, if you will, going into the weekend.
It's not summer. Still a Friday.
It is not. It is fall. This is Bloomberg.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow higher, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both in the red. However, U.S. stocks on track for their third consecutive week of gains. Let's head right over to the the first word. We'll get it right. First word, breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Shaw. That's right. U.S. stocks are trading mixed right now, with the Dow currently up 161 points. S&Ps are down 7, while the NASDAQ declines by 0.4%. The U.S. 10-year yield at 3.75%. Gold is down 20 points. Oil trading in the green, but Bitcoin, that's higher by 1.7%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were energy and utilities. Tech was under pressure, and leaders to the upside in the Dow, Chevron and Amgen, while Amazon fell 1.2% and led to the downside. After earnings, Costco fell 1.4%, and in other news, China urged local companies to stay away from NVIDIA's AI chips. Wrapping things up, Wynn Resorts rose 7%. Shares were upgraded over at Morgan Stanley. Live from the First Breaking News Desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney, and to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type Squawk, SQUA, on your Bloomberg terminal. For on-demand, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car, I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
TikTok, everybody. I love doing that on the Friday edition of Bloomberg Business
TikTok.
Week.
Sounds good.
Yeah, we've got stocks well off our highs of the session. A little bit of movement, as you just heard from Charlie Pellet. But it's been an interesting week, and we had an important inflation print this morning, so we continue to get some news on that. Some jobless information yesterday, but next week's a big one with Jay Powell, and certainly that monthly jobs report come Friday. But 1 week, a little under 1 week from today.
I highly recommend going on vacation and coming back on a Friday.
Oh, do you now?
Yeah, I think in
Tim's
terms of
was there,
strategy,
exactly.
it's a nice way to sort of ease back into things.
Yeah. What a week it's been, right?
You have some pretty good
I do
tactics when it comes to vacation. Yeah.
It is something about you cut the middle of the week.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you do.
You
Take
come back on
a
a
few long
Wednesday.
weekends,
Yeah.
maybe include Labor Day in there. That's kind of a Carol Master special.
My playbook?
Yeah, that's a playbook. Come back and there's a big sell-off.
I do. Every time I go
know.
away. Stock sell-off.
That's not what happened when I was away.
Let's see what our next guest has to say about the Wall Street playbook. Mackenzie Peterson is with us, VP of Marketing at Advisor Shares. They've got about $2 billion in assets under management, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hey, Mackenzie, good to have you here with us. We do wonder about strategies, flows. What are you guys seeing when it comes into your various ETFs? Where's the money going in? Where's the money coming out?
Sure, of course. Well, definitely, first, thanks for having me on. Really, really appreciate it. I was super sad to miss you guys both at Future Proof in California. But glad to talk
Carol was
now.
there, though.
I know. I was at a booth, so I was a little bit locked in, but I wish I could have come by and said hi. But seemed like a fun conference in general, which is fantastic.
Come on, you're right next. You're on the beach. It's totally fun.
It's pretty beautiful. Did you like Third Eye Blind?
I had to go home by it.
You had to get back to the film
So I
reserve.
think I would have if I could have, but I was on a plane as soon as
Third
our
Eye
broadcast
Blind
was
play?
over. Yeah, exactly.
They did.
Wow.
I get it. Busy work. But
It's
okay,
like
fair enough.
Coachella for Wall Street.
All right,
It's
next year
just
I'm
kind of what
going.
it is.
Next
All right.
year I'm going.
All right. So talk to us about where flows are in and out for you guys.
Yeah, so I think we're definitely seeing a lot of flows into sort of thematics. That's been definitely something that we've seen as a big positive kind of in general. Definitely seeing some in kind of fixed income too, kind of broadly looking where people are allocating, which is kind of surprising, I think, ultimately when you're looking at kind of the market. I think that's kind of something a lot of people are focused, of course, on tech, all those different things. But ultimately, I think the thematics really have been where we've been seeing flows for ourselves personally.
What kind of thematics? Let's dig a little bit deeper.
Well, so we've definitely seen some flows in kind of a controversial one a little bit, but in cannabis actually, which ties in, I think, to California pretty well. But that's been kind of a theme that we've been seeing and focused on. But there's also definitely been kind of the travel theme. It's been a little bit lighter, but I think something that a lot of people can kind of connect to, both from kind of an investing perspective, but as well as just people travel from time to time. And then as well, restaurants sort of eating, people going out for lunch during the workday, or ordering in kind of late at night. It's time for that.
Who has time for that?
What, to go out?
Yeah, during the workday.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
That is true. That is true. You need to live in a place that's walkable, I think, to get that done. But
it's a little bit of takeout, maybe. I actually had a hamburger last night that we were ordering because we were both just
but
like
that wasn't
wiped
during
out.
the workday. When's
No.
the last time you went out for lunch?
It's a bag of peanuts every. You know what I
Yeah,
eat for
I
lunch.
know. That's just how we roll, though.
And a banana.
Hey, okay, so cool to hear themes. I also want to hear some individual stock picks because we love it when our guests send us stocks, and you did that. We got Carnival. Company is reporting earnings next week, I believe, Carol.
What?
We have an interview with the CEO next week. I don't know if I can do a deep tease like that.
Apparently you just did.
Okay.
Done.
It's on the calendar, so I'm teasing it.
I always love talking about what's going on in that industry because especially Carnival, because I do feel like they have several different brands, hit different price points, but their big one really gets to, I feel like, a wider band across the United States. So it will be interesting to see what they have to say about that. When it comes to ETFs, and you guys think about where did you want to go?
I want to hear what she says about
okay.
Carnival.
Go.
Sorry.
Fair enough. I'm definitely going to tune in, and I think that's a good teaser. I'm definitely going to hear that interview. I think that's fantastic. Definitely looking forward to earnings and what they kind of are bringing, just because, especially last quarter, they really blew it out of the water, if you forgive the pun a little bit. But I know they, beat on the bottom line. I think $170 million they were over. I think they had all-time highs in terms of revenue, in terms of booking, all those important things. So I think it looks strong. I think in general, sort of the category for cruises seems to really have found its stride after kind of COVID really kind of hit it. So I think it'll be interesting. Ultimately, I think a lot of people are looking for different ways to travel, more kind of experience-based, and I think cruises like Carnival can kind of offer that across its wide range, like you were saying.
Another one that you like, let's get to it, Kava, which I feel like a lot of folks have
On a tear.
It is, right?
Yeah, I got like friends texting me about buying Kava shares.
Are they really?
Yeah, which is like...
It's up 187%.
People who don't work in finance, like I feel like that's a sign of something, Carol.
Well, 15% of the float is shorted too. So tell us about this one and the thoughts around it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so I feel like that one is definitely an interesting theme, one that we've been focused on for Kava. It's been kind of a crazy story, like you're saying. They only went public in June of last year and up, I think, over 200% since then. So really having some strong performance. I think in terms of what they're focused on and how they're positioning themselves is also really interesting. I know we're kind of in a value-hungry environment where, McDonald's is extending their value sale, all those different things, and they've been able to not raise their prices as much as sort of the overall limited service restaurants. I think they have raised their prices roughly 18% versus kind of the broader 30% that a lot of those restaurants have been able to take up their prices. They also have a loyalty program coming soon next month. I think it's when it's launching nationally. That's been a big trend that we've seen across restaurants where you get an app, you join the loyalty program, they give you an extra thing of fries or an extra drink with your bowl if you're at Kava, and those things really kind of tempt people in who are looking for kind of, more value right now.
When they reported in late August, apparently customers were flocking to Kava's new grilled steak offering during the quarter, even though it cost more, and that they're also adding side orders like pita chips and juice. So people kind of adding on items, right? So
do we have time for bros?
You want to go to bros?
Dutch Brothers?
You got about 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I passed a few of these in Colorado. One that wasn't even open yet.
Bros. Oh, Dutch Bros.
Dutch Brothers, yeah.
Super speedy. I feel like it's the lesser known cousin of Starbucks. It's on the coffee side of things, but they've also seen some pretty solid growth. I think generally it is also National Coffee Day on Sunday, so hopefully they'll see a little bit of a spike going on there as well. But ultimately, coffee remains a very strong theme for kind of restaurants or coffee houses like that. And I think that's one that's going to continue.
Every day is National Coffee Day in my life.
That is true.
I go to bed thinking about coffee. Is that bad?
No, it's like my favorite thing in the morning, my cup of coffee.
I'm like, oh, yeah,
I know.
I'm so excited for tomorrow because I get coffee.
And you're kind of uppity with your coffee.
Yeah, I am.
just say that?
I'm the worst. Like every bad stereotype about Brooklyn. That's me.
It's something I didn't find out until recently.
I'll make you an espresso sometime.
Yeah, right. I'm waiting. Mackenzie, thanks. Have a good weekend.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenbeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, in just about 7 minutes, we're going to head over to our TV colleagues, and we're going to count you down to the close on this Friday. It feels like that kind of a day. It's been a little bit busy in and around a lot of global leaders. We've been talking global issues, climate change, and so on. But really, it is interesting talking with global leaders how much everyone pays attention to what's going on in the United States in terms of the economy. Seeing that growth, it's so important to keeping global momentum going, but also that Fed rate cut that we got last week being a big deal. Everybody's waiting kind of for the Fed to make their move.
Did the Fed cut rates last week? I was on vacation.
How weird was that? Like to come back and miss.
Oh, come on. I was following. You should have seen when I was done. I was doing a bike ride that day as the Federal Reserve was cutting rates, and I looked at my phone when I was done with the ride. There was just so many notifications about what the Fed was doing, about what Jay Powell was saying.
Were you shocked? I was when it hit because
you had just come back from California, right?
I'd come back and I felt like people were tapering back their expectations for the Fed, and we're tapering them back for the rest of the year. So and somebody actually, our boss Colin, who oversees all of Bloomberg Radio, hi Colin, asked me, and he's like, "What do you think?" And I'm like, quarter point.
Really? Even last Tuesday, you thought that?
I did, and I said, I think it's going to be quarter point. I think that's kind of where we are. We have growth and so on and so forth.
This is why we don't play the markets, right? This is why.
I love my job, but this is why, I'm not
talk
living
about
on
it.
my private island. I'd had to ask questions, and I count on all these experts for smart answers. I was just kind of shocked. But in a Fed that's, federal officials talk so much. I'm not saying I feel managed, but I think they're very careful about making sure what they think is going on is out there so that there are no shocks for investors. I felt like there was a little bit of a shock. But the market seemed to handle it pretty well.
I'm reading this article.
Oh, you're not listening?
I was listening to you, but I
not waiting bated breath on every word I said.
Did you see this article about poker night in New York City?
Oh, no.
It's
Wake
among
up.
the most read on the Bloomberg terminal.
All right, I'm going to pull it up. That's Tim's way of saying master go to most read.
Yeah, in the last hour. It's New York City poker night draws Einhorn and Weinstein, but not Eric Adams. So on Thursday evening, Manhattan's hedge fund set filtered into the old Greenwich Savings Bank building near Herald Square.
Yeah.
For a night of poker.
They've done this before.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is the 14th annual Take 'em to School poker tournament.
Right.
Someone who wasn't there, New York City Mayor Eric Adams, he's known to enjoy nightlife and charity events. He'd been invited. He didn't show, though. Of course, earlier in the day, he'd been indicted by federal prosecutors on corruption charges.
However, the 14th annual Take 'em to School poker tournament did roll on without him. And John Petrie, managing member of Sessa Capital and member of the event committee, said, for some reason, no one from City Hall was available to join us today. Okay, guys, come on.
A seat at the tournament starts at $3,000. Tables went for as much as $100,000. A couple of professional gamblers joined the traders, portfolio managers, and quants in attendance.
Yeah, really fun color on this story. David Einhorn, founder of Greenlight Capital, stalking the floors, how our reporter wrote it, stalking the floor of Gotham Hall in a T-shirt. Most other guests sported blazers or the occasional tie.
Okay, so Brock Pierce was there. He's a former child actor. He's the co-founder of the crypto Tether. He materialized in a white trucker hat with a red heart motif. He bounced from foot to foot, detailing how many nations he advises, how he'd come through town for the UN General Assembly, and how he could save America from the devaluing of the U.S. dollar.
There's a lot of color on everybody who was there. This is a cool story.
This is a really cool story.
Does it say it raises money, right?
It does, yeah. It raises money for
much?
education reform now. It's a nonprofit in favor of charter schools. The organization faces a year of education flux at both the federal level as the presidential election approaches and locally, given the recent upheaval in New York City government.
I'm just looking to see how much money was raised. By 10:30 a.m., the party migrated to the mezzanine, where initial bets reached an eye-watering $100,000. So there was some big bets being placed. Anyway, highly recommend. As Tim said, it's the most read story in the past 60 minutes on the Bloomberg terminal. So you can get more of the back and forth that happened that evening. Who wrote the story? Oh, Annie Massa of Bloomberg News.
One of the dealers was appearing to drink from a bottle of hair conditioner.
What?
What kind of party is this?
I don't know. Not one that we were invited to.
Definitely not.
Check it out, folks. All right, over to our TV colleagues. The closing bell starting right now.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close, starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romain Bostic here, alongside Alex Steele, taking you through the Closing Bell, a global simulcast. It starts now with Scarlett Fu joining us in the TV studio, Carol Masser in the radio booth, and oh, looky here, Tim Stenovic back from the wild as we welcome our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, including our partnership with you two. Tim, you know, your shoes were so hard to fill. They actually had to get somebody all the way from jolly old England to come fly over here and fill in for you.
Had I known we could do this exchange program with Bloomberg bureaus around the world, I mean, I might plan my vacations differently.
Guess what? We actually can't. Didn't we already ask about this?
We did ask. It was the first thing I asked when I saw my boss this morning. I said, can we go do Steven's show over in London one morning? Like, maybe for a week?
Please.
Fun.
He does get up at 2 a.m. in the morning, though. He did remind us about those early morning wake-ups. Interesting week, guys. It feels like we're ending kind of with a little bit of a whimper. Looking at the NASDAQ, went down about 0.4%. But the stocks, Scarlett, those headlines on NVIDIA, some concerns, that's been under pressure all day. But the stocks is down about 1.6% here today.
Yeah, that's definitely the one I'm paying attention to. But Carol, I can't believe you didn't mention the Golden Dragon Index yet. It's only been 30 seconds.
Gainers to come.
But you know what's interesting is Bank of America, Hartnett was talking about sort of if you have 10-year Chinese yields stay around 2%, that's really the green light into the unloved stuff, unloved commodities, industrials, metals, materials, and international stocks.
Yeah, absolutely here. A mixed day here on Wall Street, though, as we're going to talk a lot about here on a weekly basis here, we are looking at pretty strong gains across the board. The Dow Jones Industrial Average on the day is going to be higher, up about 130 points or so, roughly about 0.3%. Of course, also posting a third straight week of gains. The S&P 500 up about down about 0.1% on the day. The Nasdaq down about 0.4% here on the day. But the Russell 2000 actually an outperformer here on the day, up about 7/10%. Dow Transports up a similar amount, and we should just reiterate one more time, Carol, across the board, the Dow, the S&P, the Nasdaq indices, and the Russell all posting a third straight week of gains.
Yeah, pretty amazing, right? The strength and momentum that we've been seeing as of late. I'm going to go back to the S&P 500 overall, guys, and most names, or a majority of the names, higher in today's session, 335 gaining ground on this Friday. You've got about 165 losing ground, and then Scarlett, you had 3 unchanged.
Yep, and you look at the IMAP that shows the S&P 500's 11 sectors. It's a real mix there. Tech, obviously, the biggest sector in the index, leading decliner here, losing 1%. You mentioned NVIDIA earlier. That's a big reason why. Materials actually losing about 0.25%, even though they do finish the week as your best performers. For today, energy stocks finishing in the green, up by better than 2%, recouping yesterday's declines, and of course, as oil prices move up now today.
All right, guys, let's get to some of the individual gainers. Number one in the S&P 500, Wynn Resorts, a gain of more than 7%. And in fact, it looks like it is the best performing name in the S&P 500 for the week overall, with about a 22% gain. So we've seen some significant moves in that one. So again, 7% higher. Morgan Stanley raising its rating to overweight, citing a combination of near low valuation and an underappreciated opportunity in the UAE, so United Arab Emirates. They set a price target of $104 a share. The stock closing at $97.62 a share. All right, Rocket Lab. Thank you, Tim, giving me this one. At its highs, up more than 18%, finishing the day at a gain of about 12.5% here. KeyBank Capital Markets analysts raising the target to $11 from $8 a share. The stock closing at just under 10, maintaining its overweight rating. The analyst continues to believe that the company is positioning itself to be an industry leader in both launch services and satellite manufacturing design. Stock is up about 75% here in 2024. We spoke with the CEO and founder, Peter Beck.
They're trying to be a SpaceX competitor.
They are.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting, and you can find that on our podcast feed in case you're interested.
Nice.
And this, as Scarlett mentioned, the NASDAQ Golden Dragon China
There it
Index.
is.
Yay! right, up 4% in today's session. And we know, rallying again in today's session, I should say, that index is up, guys, about 24% for the week overall. Chinese equities capping their biggest weekly rally since 2008. The trading in Shanghai, so overwhelming. They had some problems really processing all of those orders. And we know that there's been a massive round of different types of stimulus. The Chinese government really coming out to support the equity markets and real estate and so on and so forth. David Tepper coming out and saying he's buying more of everything related to China after Beijing rolled out those sweeping stimulus measures. That's what you missed this week, China stimulus.
Well, speaking of Beijing, kind of a good segue to my first decliner, NVIDIA. Shares of NVIDIA falling by about 2.2% today. This after Bloomberg reported that Beijing is stepping up pressures on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products. It's part of the nation's effort to expand its semiconductor industry and counter those U.S. sanctions. After the Bloomberg News story came out, shares dropped as much as 3.85%, but bounced off those lows to close lower by 2.2%. The move designed to help domestic Chinese AI chip makers gain more market share while preparing local tech companies for any potential additional U.S. restrictions. This is according to people familiar with the matter. And shares of Costco falling today by 1.75%. The company did post higher than expected profit as moderating prices fueled consumer spending. Store traffic also climbed. The company did report a narrow miss on revenue estimates. We did get some interesting commentary from the CFO, who said that as inflation cools, shoppers are purchasing more non-food items. So think home furnishings and tires sold particularly well, he said. Consumer electronics and appliances, he said, were actually getting cheaper. And finally, ADRs of Novo Nordisk here in the United States fell 2.85%. This after JP Morgan analyst Richard Vosser said Novo's third quarter results may show slower than expected sales of their weight loss drug Wegovy. Novo's now trading about 20% below June's record high. It's lost about 1 trillion Danish kroner. That's about $150 billion in market value. We do get the next report from Novo this coming November.
All right, I'm taking a look at the bond market. Before I get there, though, guys, I want to point out SPW, equal weighted index, closing at a record high. I'm just putting that out there. S&P couldn't make it, closing a little negative. SPW definitely did. That's 20 record highs so far this year. Bond market also seeing a bid. You're seeing yields lower, 2-year yield down by about 6 basis points, the 10-year yield down by about 4. That curve coming in at about 19 basis points. But guys, treasuries are looking at 5 straight months of gains. This will be the longest winning streak since 2010 if we can continue this rally come Monday.
All right, guys. So let's get to some of the interesting stories on our radar. And I feel like we're taking cues.
Were you dancing? Was Romaine dancing?
I was. I didn't realize I was on camera. Anyone dance.
You're always on camera.
Shout out to Tony Kornheiser. Yeah.
How you dance? Come on, everybody.
Romaine on a Friday, everyone.
Love it. Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, they're not dancing in the Swiss Alps. And I feel like in this New York, I don't mean to be such a bummer, but this New York Climate Week, looking overseas to what they're doing over in Switzerland, the Alps there. Tim, actually, this came up on your radar. They're tweaking the border because of climate change.
Yeah, so climate change is melting the glaciers that have historically marked the frontier between Switzerland and Italy. So the government of Switzerland said in a statement today, significant sections of the border are defined by the watershed or the ridge lines of glaciers, firn or perpetual snow. These formations are changing due to the melting of glaciers. Europe's the fastest warming continent, and there's some serious border-changing implications of this.
Can I tell you, I almost caused an international incident at that border.
You did?
Yeah, we went skiing, and there's a part where you can ski across the border, but we forgot our passports.
And they checked?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Really?
I mean, you don't like literally just ski across. I mean, there's a checkpoint.
Really?
Yeah, but it's like a whole thing. Like you go, there's a specific
because it's
slope.
EU versus Switzerland,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Makes
Yes.
sense. Okay,
Yes.
that
It's
makes
the
sense.
Eurozone versus Switzerland.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. That must have been quite an experience.
I mean, they were nice about it. And
You're always causing
they just shoot us
problems,
back
aren't
up on
you?
the
They're just like, oh, look at those dumb Americans.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
go.
Well,
Goodbye.
speaking of experiences that don't always come out the way you planned, there was something that took place in Detroit called the Bridgerton Ball, which was meant to evoke the hit Netflix show, except it didn't go off at all.
Oh, that looks lit. No,
Yeah, I mean, everyone's dressed up in their finest Regency wear, and
like so happy.
I mean, look at that. There's no tables there, and here they are. This is a
No
TikTok
chairs
actually
either.
talking
Really
about how
weird
it
thing,
didn't
right?
go well.
What is that?
But there was no ball. There was a pole dance.
What? Oh.
There's a pole
Really?
dancer, yeah, instead.
The pole dancer's name was Lady Whistledown.
No.
Oh, really?
Really?
No,
Wow.
that's too far.
Okay.
That's actually pretty funny. But just so those of you who haven't seen it, Bridgerton is not about pole dancing.
No?
So thinking
I have not seen the
like,
show.
Yes, essential background information. Thank you, Alex.
Thinking like, Elizabethan time, well, not as
So this seems like it has like little undertones of like Fire Fest, or I don't know if you saw that Willy Wonka thing where it was like literally like they just like got like a 5-year-old off the street and like put him in an Oompa Loompa costume.
Okay, to be fair, none of these were officially affiliated with Netflix or Bridgerton. It was some like local event company putting on
$150 a ticket though.
Show. Yes.
What?
$150 a ticket.
Wow.
Did you
go? I mean,
did they get refunds?
Did you see the one TikTok
No.
quote? Every backdrop looks like it came from Party City.
Probably did.
That hurts. That hurts.
A little
that really
bit
hurts.
of shade. Little bit of shade. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Have a Bridgerton weekend.
Yeah.
If only.
I am
Charlotte
so
was really
with
good, by the
you.
way.
Yeah, Queen Charlotte was great. Super
If
good.
only. I have nothing to say. We'll see you on Monday, everybody.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It's a Bloomberg Business Week. That's Carol Masser. I'm Tim Stenevec. Just looking at the latest updates, Carol, from our own Brian Sullivan, who follows weather here. Helene is triggering dangerous rain and flooding across the U.S. South. It's killed at least 21 people. It's cut power to over 4 million customers after coming ashore in Florida as a major hurricane. More than 5.2 million people facing moderate or high risk of excessive rain today with winds of 35 miles per hour as Helene pushes inland across North Carolina. This according to a forecaster at the U.S. Weather Prediction Center. The heaviest rain will now be shifting into Tennessee and Kentucky after pummeling portions of Georgia and the Carolinas.
I have to say, I have family in the Florida Keys. I've been messaging with them like kind of early on. They were fine, but I've also got family in the Carolinas. And like these storms, man, the intensity of them and how they linger sometimes. And sometimes it's the wind, sometimes it's just the amount of rain. It just is, I just feel like exponentially, they've just got much, much more difficult to deal with.
Well, speaking of the Carolinas, Mark Gongloff has personal experience in that area of the country. He's an editor at Bloomberg Opinion. He writes about climate change. He joins us from New Jersey. Mark, you write about your own, or you touch on your own hurricane experience when writing your most recent column about the blunt memo that Hurricane Helene has for Climate Week. Just give us a quick history of what your experience was a few years ago.
Yeah, so I was in Hurricane Hugo. I grew up in South Carolina. Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989, and I remember hearing about it hitting Charleston, and then it kept on going and stayed a hurricane all the way up until it hit Charlotte, and it passed right by where I lived in the middle of South Carolina, all the way up into North Carolina. Did a ton of destruction and damage, and I went down a few days later to help clean up in Charleston, and there were freight cars on the side of the highway and houses that had been fully underwater. And so my point when I wrote about that today was to say that there have always been hurricanes, and there have always been hurricanes that went far inland, like Helene just did. But the difference today is that the hotter waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic are taking these hurricanes when they happen and supercharging them and turning them into things that are way more destructive than they might have been if they'd happened, say, 40 or 50 years ago.
So that's the climate change connection here, because as you write, climate change didn't necessarily cause Helene, and it's not unprecedented for storms to move far inland. So how much warmer is the water that supercharges these storms now than, back in the 80s and 90s?
So they're at record highs now. And so, for example, the Gulf of Mexico water was 80 degrees down to, say, 400 feet deep, which is just incredible. I mean, if you go to the beach, in Florida or South Carolina, where I used to go, it would be maybe 80 degrees. But that would be, if you go out very deep, it would suddenly get cold. In the Gulf, it was deep. It was warm way down into the ocean. And so it was just supercharging. This storm was just a tropical rainstorm on Monday. It was barely anything off the coast of Honduras. And just over the course of a few days, it sucked up all this energy from the Gulf and then has taken all that water, and there's extra water in the air because the warmer air holds more water. And it it has made it one of the widest storms that we've ever seen. It's like 400 miles wide. Wideness does not necessarily mean intensity. You can have small and yet very intense storms. This has been both. It hit as a Category 4. It gathered strength from the Gulf, generated super high winds, and then it dumped tons of water all the way up into, say, Missouri, but also into places like the Appalachian Mountains, where I've also spent some time. I spent a summer in Boone, North Carolina, which is facing horrifying flooding right now because they'd already had a bunch of rain before this. The ground was softened up, and then they got tons and tons of rain dumped on them now. So they're starting to see landslides, roads washed out, things like that. It's very dangerous, all the way in the mountains from a hurricane that hit the Big Bend area of Florida.
So I do wonder, Mark, here we are coming off of, New York City's Climate Week, right? In conjunction with all the global leaders that are in town for the UN General Assembly. We've had a lot of conversations here throughout the week talking about climate change specifically and green initiatives. Having said that, based on the impact that climate change is having on making these storms even worse, do you feel like we're having the right conversations? Some of the things that you heard, anything that stand out that we are talking about the right things or maybe that we're not?
I feel like maybe we're talking about the right things, but I think when we're talking to each other about, people who are concerned about climate, I mean, I went to a lot of Climate Week events and we were talking about, is the transition moving quickly enough? And I think a lot of people will say that it is not, that we are not moving away from fossil fuels, that, this is heat, the disasters that we're seeing now, wildfires, bigger, more damaging storms, that's coming from just about a degree and 1.2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial averages. And we're still trying to keep that down to 1.5, but right now we're not doing a good job of that. And so one of the things we need to do is, yes, figure out how to make that happen more quickly. But when we're talking to people in the public about this, I think we're talking about the wrong things. I think a lot of people still think of this as a problem for their children or their grandchildren, when in fact it's a thing that's happening right now. There's a Dallas Fed study this week talking about how wildfire smoke is raising people's credit card debts. This hurricane is going to do billions of dollars in damages from just a storm that hit the South in a few days. And so it's already doing economic damage. And I think that's the message we need to get across, is that this is a now emergency, not a future emergency.
Talk to us about the Dallas Fed study and wildfire smoke and credit card debt. Certainly wildfire smoke affecting a lot of people, not just who live in the West during fire season, but as we saw last year, making its way throughout the United States and Canada. Mark, what's the connection to credit cards?
Well, the connection to credit cards is health, to put it quite frankly. It's people, wildfire smoke is really terrible for health. It causes heart attacks, strokes, pregnancy complications, and it's especially bad for people who have problems breathing to begin with, people with asthma, COPD, things like that. It also causes long-term health effects we're not even fully aware of right now. It's been tied to dementia, cognitive damage in children, cancer. But in the short term, the Dallas Fed studied fires over the impacts over the course of a year. And for people miles away from the Camp Fire in California in 2018, on average, their credit card debt increased by $1,400 over that year. And that was because they were going to the doctor more often and they were less able to keep up with their credit card bills. It also, tourism shuts things down. Tourism shuts down, the wildfire smoke shuts down a lot of businesses, and people lose paychecks that way too, and that influences them too. And it's not just close to the fire. They suggested that we might have added $10 billion in credit card debt in the New York area because of the wildfire smoke that hit from Canada last year. Yeah. So the effects are far-reaching.
Huge gravel bike race in Utah each year called Crusher in the Tush, where they had to cancel it this year as a result of wildfire smoke. So that's all, cyclists who are not going there spending money because of the danger of wildfire smoke.
I have to say, one of the things I was flying out to California last week for this financial conference, and flying in, the captain of the airport as we got close to LA said, okay, that's Bear Mountain in Southern California, and said you can see the wildfire smoke, and taking a shot. It was sobering. It was the most beautiful flight, easy flight, and then we finished off with that, and it was rather sobering. Mark, you still optimistic? 15 seconds here. You always leave us on an optimistic note. Is there still hope?
I'll try to be optimistic. There's hope because there's still more that we can do. And the more these things smack us in the face, maybe the more, the likelier it is that we will get our act together and do something about it.
Fingers crossed, man. Yeah, it's not our kids' problems, it's our problem. Mark Ungloff, thank you so much. Editor at Bloomberg Opinion, writes about climate change. Be sure to check all his columns out. You can find him at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg terminal, and also on X. Coming up next, America's government teacher. I'm ready. This is Bloomberg.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A third week of gains for the U.S. stock market. S&P this week up by 0.6%. Again on the week. By the way, it's up in 6 of the last 7 today. Did turn out to be a down day for the S&P 500 index. We'll call it little change, but a loss nonetheless, down 0.1%. S&P fell 7. The Dow today up 137, up by 0.3%. NASDAQ lower by 70, a decline there of 4 0.4%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares did gain by 0.7%. 10-year yield 3.75% with a 2-year that's yielding 3.55%. Spot gold down 0.7%, 26.52, retreating from a record. And West Texas Intermediate crude higher on Middle East tensions. We had West Texas Intermediate up 1.3%, 68.57 a barrel. Beijing is stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced AI chips instead of NVIDIA products, all part of the nation's efforts to expand its semiconductor industry and counter U.S. sanctions. NVIDIA today down by 2.1%. Again, recapping, stocks lower. S&P slumped 7, down 0.1%. Finishing the week, heading into the weekend at 57.38. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really do appreciate it. Well, as we mentioned, she's a former high school government and law teacher who's now known by many as America's government teacher. She's got more than 1 million followers on Instagram. And just in the last few months, she's interviewed both Tim Walz as well as Vice President Kamala Harris.
The reality is that in this election, everything is at stake in terms of, one, having capable, competent leadership, but also what is at stake in terms of the risk on the other side of that split screen of having chaos and the potential destruction of our democracy.
That's Vice President Kamala Harris being interviewed by Sharon McMahon, who back on March 20th was before President Joe Biden dropped out of the race, about 4 months before.
She wasn't a candidate yet.
She wasn't a candidate yet. Look how much things have changed in such a short time. Sharon McMahon, also has a new book out. It's called The Small and the Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History.
Sharon joining us from Washington, D.C. Sharon, so great to have you here with us. And we want to talk about the book that you've got out. Looking forward to that. But we've got to ask you about talking to Kamala Harris, talking to Tim Walz, your experience, that conversation, and then kind of where we are here on this Friday, September 27th. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, you're right. A lot really has changed, hasn't it? When I met with Kamala Harris, she was still stumping for Joe Biden. You could hear that she was talking about, how much is at stake in this election, but it was certainly well before she had decided that, her name was going to be on the ticket and before Joe Biden had decided he was going to lead. One of the things that I was struck by Kamala Harris, and I've met her a number of times actually, is that she absolutely knows how to be a very serious individual who takes issues very, very seriously. As you heard in the little clip that you played, she was speaking in a way that is quite authoritative. But she also has another side to her personality, which is on display, which is a more sort of fun-loving, joyful side to her personality. You see her smile and laugh quite a bit, which I think is something that a lot of, it's missing with a lot of politicians. You don't see a lot of members of Congress get on TV or give interviews where they're having fun. And that's something that I think sets the Harris-Walz campaign apart. Whether or not you want to vote for them, it's a difference of perspective, and that they're trying to make politics fun.
Do you think that she, since she's become a candidate versus when she was vice president, she's less accessible to people like you? One of her criticisms, especially from the right, has been that she's not doing interviews.
Well, once she became a candidate, the amount of attention for her time, the vying for her time, was obviously very, very significant. And she has such an abbreviated schedule with which to win the presidency. I actually think it's an interesting case, which is something that I've said many times, is that we don't actually need a year and a half to choose who our president will be.
Agreed,
Yes.
right? This should be faster, but go ahead.
Yes, most of us can make a decision in a couple of months. We actually don't need 18 months of constant bombardment. It's exhausting. Most Americans find it quite exhausting. So I do think some of it is related to that. Obviously, I do not speak for her. I'm not affiliated with the campaign in any way. But I do think that some of it is just like trying to build the plane while flying it and trying to do all of the rallies. It doesn't leave a lot of time to do as many sit-down interviews. Of course, she's done some since then. But I do think there's just this element of like, how do I build an entire ground game in the next 1 week? You know what I mean? Like there's an element of we got to move quickly here. Yes.
Well, how do we change the system? Is it a little bit of a broken one considering what happened, with the Capitol following, Donald Trump not accepting the outcome and the uprising? I mean, do you feel like our system is broken in terms of the Electoral College? Like, how are you thinking about it bigger and broadly? Here we are, a nation that, what are we, over a quarter of us, more than 250 years old and counting. And is it time to kind of do a little bit of a reboot? But how do we get there when the people in government are the ones kind of making these decisions and maybe kind of like the way it works? Maybe it works in their favor.
Yeah, it does work in their favor. I think that's true. And I do think that it is time to reform the electoral system in a number of ways. I don't think the system, first of all, works the way that the founders or the framers intended it to work. But I also think that the framers were very clear that the system should be refined as needed, which is why they built two separate ways to amend the Constitution right there into the document, right? This is not Holy Scripture. This is a like, hey, here's a working document with some of our ideas of how we might run this country. And if it's not working out, here's two ways we can change it. So the concept of winner take all in the Electoral College, that's not in the Constitution. Winner take all actually didn't develop until 30 to 40 years after the Constitution was ratified. The framers never intended for a winner take all Electoral College. And most Americans do not feel well represented by the way the current system works. If you are a blue voter in Alabama or a red voter in California, I guarantee that there's an element of feeling disenfranchised by the way the system works. But I would also advocate for a couple of other changes. One of them is, as you mentioned, an abbreviated election period. We don't need to spend $1 billion each. That's what Biden and Trump each spent in 2020, $1 billion each. Most Americans agree we could find better things to spend $2 billion on than flyers that are put in the trash and commercials that air for 30 seconds at a time. That's one way. I also think so many Americans feel like the way the process for choosing nominees is broken. The process for how do we get to pick which person is going to represent us, the primary process, because they happen in a sort of like dominoes fall. If you're in a state with early primary, you get an outsized amount of input. State with a late primary, often there's only one person left standing. Why can't all Americans have a say on one national primary election day?
I agree. It's interesting. I heard on a podcast that I listened to and said that one thing to keep in mind, though, when you look at the election outcome when Donald Trump was elected, and I'm not taking sides here, but just understanding, we know this upcoming race probably expected to be a very close one. So you need to understand that when you have candidates, whether it was Joe Biden and Donald Trump or Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, who are very, very different individuals, that depending on who wins or loses, in the case of when Donald Trump was in the White House, that there is roughly half of America who agree with or like who he is as a leader. And you could say for the other side. And when you have such a difference, like how do we make it so a government that is much more representative of people who feel very different about the way forward, not just as leaders, but as Americans?
Yeah. I think this is the problem that we're having now, which is that there is not an ideological center of the country. We have these sort of, farther left and farther right. And yes, you can make a lot of arguments that what's far left in America is not far left overseas. I understand all of that. But an ideological center is a moderating force in politics. It's a moderating force on the Supreme Court. It's a moderating force in Congress. You have to convince the people in the ideological center that the position that's slightly to the right or slightly to the left is the one worth taking. And that ideological center is often persuadable by the best arguments, by the best ideas. And so right now, the electoral system heavily favors people who are more ideologically extreme, more ideological, farther to the right or to the left. And that ideological center is something that we've eliminated by and large by gerrymandering and, by other mechanisms that, again, were never intended by the framers to be used. And that ideological center is something that Americans can choose to vote for if they want to. They can choose to vote for those candidates who are less extreme.
So you're optimistic about that, because it does seem like in recent years we've just become more polarized and we've become more extreme.
Well, I mean,
I think Sharon's connection is having some issues right now. We're going to work to get that back. We're speaking with Sharon McMahon. They refer to her as America's government teacher. She's recently interviewed Governor Tim Walz, also a few months ago, before she was the candidate for president, Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, one of the things I'm curious about is, so teacher, years of serving as a high school government and law teacher, but then went to social, Instagram in particular. She's
got to hear her story, right?
Well, and I want to understand the use of social media, where we have talked so much, Tim, right, about the misinformation that's out there and the worry that how that impacts how people vote, where they get their information. We are talking with Sharon McMahon. Sharon, I know you were in the middle of a thought. Do you want to finish it, or?
Yeah, I was just saying that we can't make positive change by having a fatalistic viewpoint that nothing good can ever happen. If you want positive change to happen, you have to have hope that it will. And I like to reiterate that hope is not a feeling that you wait to experience where you're just going to wake up one morning and the birds are going to be chirping and the sky's going to be blue. Our ancestors, the people who built this country, operated on this assumption that hope was a choice that they could make. And it was that choice from which all good things would follow.
Well, I think about immigrants, right? Or my, ancestors made a choice
to leave the country that they were in.
Right.
Come to the U.S. for ostensibly a better life.
Right, and not so easy initially, right? But they made that choice because they thought, longer term. Hey, Sharon, sit tight. We're going to do a little bit of news and come back, because we do want to get into your book, The Small and Mighty, those 12 unsung Americans who changed the course of history from the founding to the civil rights movement. As you said, the book, I feel like there's often people that we know in history, right, that we've all studied growing up and so on and so forth, but there were so many more individuals, right, that shaped kind of where we are today.
Yeah, and again, want to hear more about her story and how she made the transition using social media.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Teacher to podcaster, influencer,
right,
educator.
I'm curious about the feedback she gets as she talks about politics, which is so heated today, and it feels like people are so one-sided, right, and not open to other ideas. All right, we're going to come back with Sharon McMahon, educator, influencer. As we said, her book is The Small and the Mighty, joining us from Washington, D.C. Just a recap of how we ended on Wall Street, Tim. Kind of a mellow day.
Yeah, down 0.1% on the S&P 500, 0.4 on the NASDAQ, but the NASDAQ higher by 1% for the week. The S&P up 0.6% for the week. The Dow closing at a record, up this week 0.6%.
just stated differently. Well, maybe it's the same thing, just stated differently, but you understand it better if you go at it the way we do. Is to identify the main stupidities that do bright people in, and then organize your patterns of thinking and development so you don't stumble into those stupidities. Berkshire Hathaway is constantly kissing off ideas, and he went about 2 seconds flat. We know we've got opportunity X, which is better than the new opportunity. Why do we want to space 2 seconds thinking about X? Many of you come from places that don't do that. You've got to have one horse, one rabbit, one something or other, and that rabbit is going to be thinking about something which would be ruled out immediately by an opportunity cost available generally to the place. But it's in a different department, and you have to be diversified, and so on and so on. So it's easy to drift into this idea that opportunities don't matter. You've got some different way of doing things that are better. It isn't better. The right way to make decisions in practical life is based on your opportunity costs. When you get married, you have to choose the best you can find that'll have you. And the rest of life is the same damn way. And you have to figure these things out if you want good results in life. And if you don't, well, you have to pretend that you can get good results in life. And if you have enough sales ability, maybe you can get by with it. Sure, there are a lot of things in life way more important than wealth. All that said, some people do get confused. I play golf with a man. He says, "What good is health? You can't buy money with it." If I can be optimistic when I'm nearly dead, surely the rest of you can handle a little inflation. If you mix the mathematics of the chain letter or the Ponzi scheme with some legitimate development like the development of the internet, you are mixing something which is wretched and irrational and has bad consequences with something that has very good consequences. But you know, if you mix raisins with turds, they're still turds. That's why they had me write the annual report. I would rather throw a viper down my shirt front than hire a compensation consultant. A director getting $150,000 a year from a company who needs it is not an independent director.
Update, Charlie Pellet, really do appreciate it. Let's get right back to Sharon McMahon. She's got a new book out. It's called The Small and the Mighty. 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History. She's a former high school government and law teacher. She's got more than 1 million followers on Instagram. She's interviewed many individuals, Carol, including Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz.
She's definitely all in on government and politics. We can tell it's really fun. It's one of our, obviously, in an election year, it's been an interesting election year. It's been fun to cover and talk about. Sharon, who are these unsung heroes? And like, I don't know, how did you kind of go about this process? Why did you want to write it? Give us a little bit of background.
You know, as you mentioned, I've been a teacher for a long time, and it is often the stories of the people you've never heard of that are some of the most interesting. They're the stories that children and adults alike feel like, dang, I wish I had known about them before, you know? So those kinds of stories, the stories that you just don't see in the bold face in the textbooks, that are often the most intriguing. You know, Americans love like the secret of some kind, the secret story behind something that happened, right? That's just sort of innate human nature. So I have found them interesting for a long time. And when I conceptualized this book and wanted to sort of bring some of these thinking about is who has made a significant contribution, a significant impact where they were with the resources available to them. I think we often mistakenly believe that the levers of power that are accessed by government are the only ways to make a difference. And the people in this book, by and large, do not access power via the levers of government. They most of the time are not wealthy or famous, Most of them had very significant challenges in their own lives, and yet they set out by virtue of circumstance and luck in many cases, did something truly extraordinary with their lives.
The examples in your book end in the 1950s, and I'm wondering if there are any examples today of people who are alive that wielded power outside of traditional government channels that we can look to who are currently alive.
Well, there's many of them, of course. Whether I would put them in a book is another story.
Good point.
But of course, like Elon Musk is a great example of somebody who, who doesn't belong in my book, of course, but he's a great example of somebody who is using a tremendous amount of power outside of the levers of government. But most of the people in this book had no such large platform from which to jump like Elon does. Did not have billions of dollars, did not have the ability to buy a mouthpiece the size of Twitter/X. But there are absolutely still great Americans. I think we often think of great Americans as being like the people in the black and white pictures or the oil paintings of the past. And I really want to dispel that notion that great Americans were people of the past. They're people today.
And I think many would argue that some of the poll workers, right, of the last few years in elections are those unsung Americans and heroes. Give us one or two, if you will, that are in your book.
One of the people that I really love in this book is a woman named Septima Clark, who had a very tumultuous upbringing. She almost commits suicide, is saved the last moment from committing suicide. On more than one occasion, she's like falsely arrested, fired, had just terrible circumstances happen to her. And she's eventually let go from her job as a teacher. And it is being let go from her job that allows her the time to start teaching adults. And one of the people that she begins to teach is a woman named Rosa Parks. And it is Septima Clark who begins something called Citizenship School that helps train African Americans all over the South to become voters, to become elected officials, to figure out how to make things happen for their own communities. And she said something that I think is really worth remembering today, which is that at the end of her life, someone asked her, what have you learned? And she says, I have learned that I can work with my enemies, because you never know when they might have a change of heart at any moment. And what a sentiment that I feel like we really need today, because in an era where we just delete and block people we don't like, Septima Clark was out there working with her enemies because she knew they could have a change of heart at any moment.
Hey, I'm wondering, Sharon, about whether or not you're concerned that stories such as these get buried in the fights about U.S. history that are happening across the country, the book bans, the changing of curriculums.
I don't think that my book is going to be banned necessarily, but I absolutely...
Not your book necessarily, but where their stories appear outside of your book, where, students not learning about these people.
I absolutely do. I absolutely share the very real concern about the sanitizing of history, because history is full of amazing things, but it's also full of many, many difficult things with which we must grapple. And that exercise of grappling with our history is an important one. It's an important one for our own intellectual development, and it's an important one for our own reckoning with our country. How can we be better if we don't know where we've come from?
Hey, one of the things, and I'm going to give this props to one of our producers, Cece, who's sharing. Are you a Gen Z? Yeah,
she's more or less. She's
okay.
Like
more or less.
Millennial, I guess.
She's young, though, or younger. In terms of how do we get, what are your thoughts about getting Gen Z to vote, getting them to the voting booth, actually, participate in this election? Is it about education? What is it?
Yeah, I think Gen Z is actually really motivated to vote. More than millennials were motivated to vote when they came of age, certainly more than Gen X or boomers when they came of age. I think Gen Z is uniquely motivated to vote this election season, and I think they are one of the demographics that is very significantly undercounted when it comes to polling results. Do you know any Gen Zers that answer the telephone? No, they don't answer the phone. So their ability to poll Gen Z is very, very limited. So in terms of how to motivate them to show up, I think we're doing it. I think understanding the gravity of an election like this is important.
You use social media, just got 30 seconds. Can it, I don't know, it feels like it can be so heated, certainly when it comes to politics. Just quickly, 25 seconds, your thoughts on social media and the use of it.
It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used for incredible harm and a tool that can be used for incredible good. I've raised over $10 million to give away on social media and registered thousands of people to vote.
Yeah.
It's a tool that you need to know how to wield.
All right. Well, we had fun with you. Sharon McMahon, The Small and the Mighty is her new book. Check it out. Love talking politics.
She's on a book tour. My sister going to see her on Thursday in Denver, actually. She just texted me.
I love that.
Very cool. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It's Bloomberg Business Week, and it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and every day at this time, we're celebrating significant moments in Hispanic heritage. Now, with your installment for September 27th, here's Bloomberg's Sebastian Escobar.
Thank you, Tim. On this day in 2021, Jose Diaz-Balart becomes the only U.S. journalist to anchor both cable and broadcast television in English and Spanish.
I'm Jose Diaz-Balart, and right now, the stage is set for a high-stakes week on Capitol Hill.
The Cuban-American journalist joined MSNBC to host Jose Diaz-Balart Reports while taking on a broader role at Telemundo, anchoring monthly specials and breaking news events and anchoring NBC Nightly News on Saturday on NBC News. He also anchored special coverage on several platforms, including Peacock. Diaz-Balart began his journalism career in 1983. He earned multiple Emmy Awards and interviewed numerous United States presidents, newsmakers, political leaders, and thought leaders. He also moderated U.S. presidential debates. Jose's bilingual career in journalism reminds us the importance of speaking multiple languages. That's Today in Hispanic Heritage. I'm Sebastian Escobar.
Thank you so much. That's Bloomberg's Sebastian Escobar here with today's installment of Hispanic Heritage Month.
All right, folks. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and get to certainly something that we cover a lot here at Bloomberg and what's going on in the world of higher education and the money connected with it. The University of Chicago is receiving a $100 million donation to support the principles and practice of free expression, bolstering a shift at U.S. colleges after a wave of campus turmoil spurred by the Israel-Hamas war. It's something we've talked about a lot. A lot of heads at top schools are there no more because of all of this.
Janet Lauren is Bloomberg News higher education finance reporter. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about this story. One is the anonymity of the donor. The other one is the recipient of the donation, the University of Chicago. A lot of our listeners know it for the economics school of the University of Chicago, the School of Economics, but give us an idea of why this is the recipient of this huge donation.
Well, this has just been in their DNA for more than 100 years, to their founding, that colleges are places of inquiry. They want to know both sides, and that's just been who they are forever. And then in 1967, there was this landmark report by a Professor Kelvin, and lots of schools have referenced it, the Kelvin Report, and they talk about institutional neutrality, having open debate, and it really brings up a lot of issues that we've heard at other campuses that brings questions of trust in higher education. Many schools seem to have one viewpoint. There's not a lot of viewpoint diversity, as they say. Colleges, should they be taking positions on things that don't affect them? Lots of issues. And when the University of Chicago's president explained their principles to me, it made so much sense. He said, if the institution starts to take political positions and does so over and over again, then it increasingly sends the message to those who have a different viewpoint that they don't belong here. And it really makes a lot of sense, and they're being rewarded for these efforts, and they've held forums with other colleges, other professors have come. That's part of their mission, is to help other schools, as well as teach how students can have difficult conversations about difficult topics, such as the Israel-Palestine war.
So this is about allowing freedom of speech really on campus for students to speak out, even if it's controversial, even if folks don't agree, but to have that conversation with differing views. It's not necessarily, though, in terms of an institution to kind of be a part of that.
They want to hear the other side because it makes their arguments better. Critique my arguments instead of shutting them down.
It's like healthy debate, right? Like think about, right, which is such a part of high school, it's a part of college campuses, and it's kind of got away.
Well, and you think about students, maybe they don't have the same viewpoint, and their TAs have a very different viewpoint, very often very progressive, often, to far left. And if you don't have that opinion and you're an 18 or a 20-year-old kid, well, you feel uncomfortable talking and having a debate because you think the TA is going to judge you, and that is not what college is about.
We have about a minute left, Janet. The donor's identity, we don't know this. This person is anonymous.
Yes, and I did ask it to the head of the forum, a very smart law professor by the name of Tom Ginsburg. And he said, well, freedom of speech also includes the freedom not to speak, and being silent is okay.
Especially if you're given $100 million and you're remaining anonymous. I think you're going to be said. It will be said that it's okay to be anonymous.
It is good, though, to see that there's this kind of support, but reminding this is what colleges and universities are supposed to be about. I think it's really cool stuff. Janet Lauren, thank you so much. Higher education finance reporter here at Bloomberg News. Be sure to check it out at Bloomberg.com. New York Times out with a story involving OpenAI.
Yeah, Mike Isaac and Aaron Griffith reporting some new figures. OpenAI expecting about $3.7 billion in annual sales in 2024. OpenAI monthly revenue, Carol, hit